Okay, very good afternoon to our distinguished panelists and participants. May I like first to extend my utmost appreciation to Ambassador Olivier Chambard, of the French Ambassador to Indonesia and East Timor. My utmost appreciation also goes to Ambassador Owen Jenkins, the British Ambassador to Indonesia and East Timor. Very good to have you, sir, this afternoon. Also to our distinguished panelists from our first and second session and all of our participants, very good afternoon and welcome to CSIS Indo-Pacific webinar. Just a small housekeeping announcement before we begin for the opening remarks. My name is Gilang Kembara. I'm a researcher here at the Department of International Relations at CSIS Indonesia. I'd just like to kindly remind our audience today that this is a public event. The event is currently being live streamed on YouTube, so please be checked. You can access our event through our YouTube channel as well. And please refrain. I'd just like to add another housekeeping announcement that the working language for today's event will be in English, and there will be no simultaneous interpretation into Indonesia or any other languages. The event will also be note-taken by our staff at CSIS, and I believe that's all. And it will be recorded by our staff as well in here at CSIS. And I think I've exhausted my housekeeping announcement before I begin. Thank you very much for your attention. Now, I would like to start with the opening remarks from Dr. Phillips Vermonte, our Executive Director at CSIS. Please, Pa Phillips, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Gilang. Very good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on Indo-Pacific strategies, shared limitation amidst geopolitical dynamics. It's been long planned. Now we are happy that this discussion will take place. I would like to thank Excellencies Ambassador Olivier Chambard, French Ambassador to Indonesia and East Timor, and also Ambassador Owen Jenkins, British Ambassador to Indonesia and East Timor. We would like to extend our gratitude for this collaboration between CSIS, the French Embassy, and the British Embassy. The aim of this event is that we would like to touch base and underline the fundamental objectives of the various Indo-Pacific strategies or initiatives that are currently being presented by various countries. ASEAN dialogue partners and various world powers, essentially. And today's event will present Indo-Pacific strategies from 4 different stakeholders, because Indo-Pacific is such a wide range geopolitical construct. So we have to consider all the interests and participation of stakeholders to this vast geopolitical construct. Now we are going to discuss perspectives from France, from the European Union, the United Kingdom, and for sure ASEAN. By having these multiple stakeholders in one event, as the one that we are going to have this afternoon, we are hoping that analysts, public who are interested in the development of this Indo-Pacific as an Indo-Pacific region could make and could compare notes and to make comparison of each of the strategies and what it offers to the Indo-Pacific region. As it's been said too many times, that for us in Southeast Asia, we would like to see Southeast Asia as a region of cooperation, not as a region of competition. And that would be I think the baseline for this Indo-Pacific region. As such, panelists will present 2 dimensions of each Indo-Pacific strategies. The first one would be on the political security dimension, and a second one on the infrastructure, investment, and economic dimensions. And I would also extend our deep appreciation to distinguished panelists that we are lucky to have this afternoon. And I hope that we are going to have a very fruitful discussion. Thank you. Back to you, Gilang.
Thank you very much, Pa Phillips. I forgot to mention that this student webinar is a collaboration between CSIS, the French Embassy, and also the British Embassy. So we really thank them for their co-organization. And next on my list, may I have Ambassador Olivier Chambard to present his opening remarks, please. The screen is yours, Ambassador. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear Dr. Visentin, for your introduction. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Selamat siang. First of all, I would like to thank CSIS, which celebrated its 50th anniversary a little over a month ago, for organizing today's online event on a topic, the Indo-Pacific, which has become central for many states, including France. Let me begin by recalling that France has a long history of engagement and a long-standing partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, a large era stretching for us from the coasts of East Africa to the American shores of the Eastern Pacific. This engagement and our cooperation efforts in support of our Indo-Pacific partners have deepened in recent years. The French Indo-Pacific strategy, launched by President Macron in his speech at Garden Island in Sydney in May 2018, formalized, in a way, this long-standing commitment in a region that has become key to the world's various balances and is now facing multiple challenges amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic. Challenges like evolution of strategic balances in Asia, socio-economic crisis induced by the pandemic, terrorism, transnational organized crime, cyber threats, nuclear proliferation, decline of multilateralism, effects of climate change, and environmental degradation, which hinders the sustainable development of some states, to name but a few. The pandemic has only confirmed how interconnected we are and how much more efficient it is to work together rather than to confront each other. The difficulties we need to address today, among others in the Indo-Pacific, require greater collective action, greater international cooperation, and greater multilateralism. As I just mentioned, France has been engaged for a long time in the region, not only because of its long-time partnerships and cooperations with the countries of the region and regional organizations, but also because it shares the concerns of its neighbors as an Indo-Pacific nation, with its territories located in both the Pacific and Indian Oceans, thanks to which France has the second largest exclusive economic zone after the United States, with its more than 7,000 French subsidiary companies, 2 million citizens, as well as its permanent military forces, more than 8,000 defense personnel stationed through the era, making France the only European partner actively present in the Pacific, but also in the Indian Ocean. France, therefore, has specific interests in this region that justify the implementation of a national strategy specific to this region. Since then, other European countries, Germany and the Netherlands and the European Union, have also developed their own vision for this region. The finalization of the EU strategy will be one of France's main priorities during its presidency of the EU in the first half of 2022. In this region, France promotes a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, in which it intends to seek synergies with the major players in the region and consolidate the partnerships it has developed with like-minded countries, India, Japan, as well as with ASEAN and Indonesia, which occupy a central position in this era. Our aim is to provide countries in the region with alternatives to fulfill their needs while respecting their sovereign interests. Let me now briefly present the 4 pillars on which is based France's strategy to strengthen its action in the Indo-Pacific. The first pillar aims at contributing to peace and stability in the region and the defense of France's sovereign interests. Rear Admiral Jean-Mathieu Rey, who is the Joint Commander of the Asia-Pacific Zone, will tell you more about this security and defense pillar in a few minutes. The second relates to economy, connectivity, research, and innovation. Our aim is to contribute to the post-pandemic recovery by developing and improving connectivity in support of the efforts of the countries of the region, as well as physical and digital infrastructures, because the needs are immense. But also to promote and enforce existing international standards, to establish a fair competitive framework and deepen our research and innovation partnerships. Dr. Frédéric Gras, Senior Fellow at the Center for Analysis, Planning and Strategy of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Associate Researcher in many well-known think tanks, will develop this pillar in more details in the second session of this webinar. The third pillar of our strategy deals with the promotion of fair and equitable multilateralism, a rules-based and lawful international order, and our commitment to free movement and free trade. Our common prosperity depends on our ability to uphold the international commitments we make. In this respect, the Indo-Pacific is a central region in more ways than one. France's contribution to the development of multilateralism is concretely materialized by its increased involvement in regional organization. For example, in the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA, of which France has become a full member in December 2020, the heads of Asian Coast Guard agencies meeting, in which France has participated as an observer for the first time 2 years ago, and the recap agreement, which fights against piracy, that we want to join. On the Pacific side, France is a member of the Pacific Islands Post-Forum Dialogue since 1989 and a founding member of the Pacific Community and the Pacific Regional Environment Programme. At the center of the Indo-Pacific region, ASEAN plays a central role for France, which will build on its new status as development partner of ASEAN to further develop its relation and existing cooperation with ASEAN member states in various fields to help post-pandemic recovery. Our efforts will be supported by the extensive network of French agencies and research institutes, which have developed solid partnerships across the region. More than 170 projects have been supported between 2015 and 2020, and 4 billion euros of fundings have already been provided by the French Development Agency since 2010 for the sustainable development of ASEAN. France has also been admitted as an observer to ASEANOPOL, and in July, our Minister for Foreign Affairs confirmed to the ASEAN Secretary General our interest in joining as observer the Working Group's Maritime Security and Peacekeeping Operation of ADMM+, given the recent change in the rules governing engagement with non-plus country. Finally, the last pillar, but certainly not the least, on which I would like to dwell a little bit more, aims at increasing partner involvement in the region in the fight against climate change and in making progress on the energy transition, protecting biodiversity and the oceans, and improving the response to natural disasters. Because no country is immune to climate change, mitigating its consequences calls for cooperation and partnerships. This summer, we have seen the impact of climate change in Europe with heat waves, fires in Mediterranean states, displacing thousands of people and causing irreparable damages or floods caused by storms. The ASEAN region has not been spared, and the intensity and frequency of extreme weather-related events have also increased in this part of the world. The multiplication of climate-related disasters will increasingly have and is already having a significant repercussion on food, water, and energy security, and could ultimately lead to the redrawing of maps, create new hotbeds of tension, and affect essential infrastructures. The pandemic we are going through must also remind us that climate change has an impact on human health and could increase the risk of pandemics in the future. In this era, France is also willing to increase its cooperation efforts in research with the countries of the region. There is thus no other way and then to choose a more sustainable mode of growth, allowing the pursuit of human development without jeopardizing natural resources. This is a key issue for France, like for many countries in the Indo-Pacific, including, for example, ASEAN countries. The development of quality infrastructure, whether for better maritime connectivity, more efficient urban mobility, or transition to renewable energy, is essential to ensure the long-term development of the region, from the Reunion Island to Indonesia, via India, Vietnam, and for those countries and region, the French Development Agency provides significant funding and international expertise, for instance, for the development of renewable energies, solar, wind, hydroelectric. As you can see, these four pillars are fully in line with the priorities outlined in the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. This outlook offers us a wide scope to strengthen and even further develop our cooperation, particularly in the maritime field, in terms of connectivity and infrastructure and sustainable development, all of which will contribute to achieve the UN SDGs for 2030. We believe that in all these areas, coordinated efforts are essential. We must strive to provide shared responses to the shared challenges in the region. This is the goal of the French strategy in the Indo-Pacific, in which the logic of inclusiveness is paramount. Now, to conclude, just a word about the elephant in the room. The creation of a new islands AUKUS, which is changing the geostrategic situation in the region by reinforcing a rivalry between two blocs, makes it even more important to have another kind of partnerships. Our vision of Indo-Pacific is one of an open region, distinct from the creation of a zone of influence. Our strategy, like the strategy of the European Union, is to foster a network of partnerships, respecting our equal sovereignties, a strategy where ASEAN is central, where multilateralism is the fundamental basis. I wish you then a fruitful discussion, and I thank you very much for your attention. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kembara, for that opening remarks, sir. And last but not least, may I present Ambassador Owen Jenkins to present his opening remarks. The screen is yours, sir. Please.
Thank you very much, Pak Gilang. And thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's an absolute honor to be here. And let me start by thanking CSIS, and in particular, the Executive Director, Dr. Philips J. Vermonte, for organizing this very timely webinar. I'm also delighted to be speaking alongside His Excellency, Monsieur Olivier Chambard, Ambassador of the French Republic to Indonesia and the Timor-Leste. This webinar is particularly timely because it's always a good idea to get together, to talk, and to listen to other points of view so that we can find common ground and agree how we can advance our shared goals. In an ever more complex and at times contested world and region, it's particularly important to be holding events such as this now. And that's true not least because we have a range of Indo-Pacific strategies, tilts, and so on in front of us. Transport for London is much better now, but it used to be said that you would wait 1 hour for a London bus and then 3 would come along together. I don't know if anyone was waiting for an Indo-Pacific strategy, but they're certainly lining up. But fortunately, I don't think we have to choose which one to get on because they're all going in the same direction. What the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt, the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and the EU's strategy for the Indo-Pacific all have in common is a desire to achieve sustainable growth and economic well-being by strengthening ties, boosting trade, and reinforcing the norms and rules that underpin free trade, security, and stability, including human rights and support for open societies. Ambassador Chambard has already referred to the French strategy on the Indo-Pacific, and it's not for me to comment on that in this forum, but I think that what you will hear from me is very much consistent with what Ambassador Chambard has just said, and the French strategy coming early in this queue of strategies, I think set the way for much that followed. But even more importantly, all of these strategies align with the countries in the region's own goals, not least with Indonesia's very welcome G20 presidency ambitions to promote productivity, resilience, empowerment, partnership, and collective leadership. So if we're all going in the same direction, why do we need new strategies to ensure these common goals are achieved? I think it's because the world and the Indo-Pacific region in particular are continually changing. We can't just keep doing the same things in the same ways. And it's right to ensure and to scrutinize that we're aware of what's changing and that we're able to respond in a planned and thoughtful manner. But our responses also need to be based on an appreciation of the fundamentals which don't change and which we need to sustain. Our shared prosperity and security rely on us following the same rules set out in the international norms, laws, and arrangements we have all signed up to. We foreign policy wonks call that web of law and agreements the rules-based international system, but it's perhaps easier to think about it as the set of things which enables our free and open societies. And it includes shared commitments to the rule of law, to freedom of navigation, to unimpeded supply routes, shared security, and so on. These are the very foundations of the Indo-Pacific region's growing prosperity and prominence, and all need scrupulous maintenance, enhancement, and safeguarding. And it's in that context that I would like to touch on the creation of AUKUS. This one element of the United Kingdom's approach to protecting these norms has come under significant scrutiny in the Indonesian media recently, and Ambassador Kembara has alluded to one interpretation of that. AUKUS is a new trilateral security partnership between the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia. Its first initiative will be collaboration on nuclear-powered submarines for the Royal Australian Navy. We've entered into this arrangement. It's not an alliance, it's not a pact, it's not a treaty, it's an arrangement, because we believe it will provide a capability that will promote the stability and security in the Indo-Pacific and underpin the region's prosperity. And I should stress that in entering into this collaboration, the United Kingdom, and I know our American and Australian partners too, take our obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty extremely seriously. Australia has a long history of adhering to the very highest standards for safeguards, transparency, verification, and accountancy measures to ensure the safety and security of nuclear material. And we would not have started this partnership if that were not the case. But I would like to stress that this arrangement, while topical, is just one part of the work that we all need to do day in and day out to maintain the foundations of an Indo-Pacific which thrives and which has high levels of well-being. In order to ensure shared prosperity and security across this critical region, we know that we have to make a long-term commitment to the Indo-Pacific. And the United Kingdom's Indo-Pacific tilt is exactly that. It's a long-term commitment to engage with and support security, stability, and prosperity in a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Strong bilateral partnerships will lie at the heart of that commitment, like the strong and growing partnership the United Kingdom has with Indonesia. But like Indonesia, we know that much of that work to secure prosperity and security will need to be done through our shared multilateral frameworks, whether under the United Nations umbrella, such as our common commitment to international maritime law, or through tailored arrangements. We have, for example, sought to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, to further enhance our trading links. And right at the center of that set of multilateral frameworks lies ASEAN, which is why we are so proud that the UK recently became the first dialogue partner of ASEAN in 25 years. And with that new status, we are more committed than ever to working closely with ASEAN as the central regional organization. The UK respects and is committed to supporting and promoting ASEAN centrality and ASEAN itself as the cornerstone of an open, respectful, and transparent multilateralism in the Indo-Pacific. So in this webinar, I look forward to hearing from highly expert and knowledgeable speakers as they share their thoughts about how the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt and others' Indo-Pacific strategies will complement each other to bolster those foundations of economic well-being, shared security, and sustainable human development in this region. And in closing, let me just recall why the Indo-Pacific is so important and why so many actors inside and outside the region are so focused on supporting security and prosperity here. By 2030, the region will generate more than 40% of global GDP. In this century, more than 4 out of every 7 people will live in Asia. The Asian Development Bank predicts that by 2050, per capita income in purchasing power parity terms will have risen 6 times in Asia to reach what Europe's is today. It's the home of production of goods and services and of trade routes which are vital to the world economy and well-being. For all of these reasons, the United Kingdom's integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy concluded that it was important that the United Kingdom should be more present in this region, that we should tilt in this direction. The United Kingdom has links with Indonesia and with the whole region which go back centuries. And we are determined that our future partnerships will also be for the long term and based on a shared commitment to safeguarding and enhancing a free, open and prosperous Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much. I look forward to the rest of the seminar.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Owen Jenkins. Thank you for your opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, we've now concluded the opening remarks, and I think we could just move on to the first session. And I believe that the opening remarks has provided us with a framing of the Indo-Pacific strategies, Indo-Pacific initiatives that are being posited by various actors throughout the world. And by today's event, I believe that we are now going to look into in greater details just what the specific issues that we can cover through the Indo-Pacific strategies. And today's event will be split into 2 sessions, where in the first session, as being mentioned before, we will look into the political security aspects of various Indo-Pacific strategies. And here we have 4 by our speakers. We will be presented by the French Indo-Pacific strategies, the British Indo-Pacific strategies, EU Indo-Pacific strategies, and last but not least, of course, we will have the ASEAN outlook of Indo-Pacific to summarize the speaker's presentation. And we will also have a discussant by the end of the session to try and wrap up and see what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, the benefits are to Indonesia, to the Southeast Asian region, and of course to the overall Indo-Pacific super region, if I can say so myself. So, and then the second session would then cover on issues that are pertinent to economic, trade, investment, and development issues within the Indo-Pacific area. And just like in the first session, we'll see the perspectives from the 4 actors or countries, and would then be wrapped up by our discussants and to see what it would affect to the whole region. And so to begin, I would like to first read out biographies of the 4 speakers and discussant of our 5 panelists of the first session. May I start with, I'd like to read out the biography of Rear Admiral Jean-Mathieu Rey. Rear Admiral Jean-Mathieu Rey currently assumed a position as the commander of the French Armed Forces in Polynesia, based in Tahiti, and also commanding general of Joint Forces Pacific since 1st of August 2020. Admiral Rey has operated at the sea for about 25 years, mainly within the Indo-Pacific, where it all started on a frigate based in Tahiti. So thank you and welcome, Rear Admiral Rey. For our second speaker, we have Mr. Gabriele Visentin as an EU Special Envoy to the Indo-Pacific and European External Service. Mr. Visentin was appointed as the EU Special Envoy for the Indo-Pacific in September 2021. He has been an official of the European External Action Service since 2011, where he served as head of the Parliamentary Affairs Division. Mr. Visentin holds a degree in law and also specialized in international and community law. So welcome, Mr. Gabriele Visentin, to our event. The third speaker, we have Mr. Tim Decamp, Deputy Director, Indo-Pacific Strategy and Delivery of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom. Mr. Tim Decamp has held a number of senior positions across the UK government, including in the Cabinet Office and Department for Exiting the European Union, where he set up the Negotiation Coordination Unit. He has joined the civil service in 2005, working in the Department for Education, Department for Business, Department for Energy and Climate Change before joining the Prime Minister's Strategic Unit in 2010. Last but not least, we have Ibu Carolina Tinangon. She's the Director of ASEAN External Cooperation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ibu Carolina Tinangon has informed me that she would run late due to prior engagement with ASEAN event. So she will join us later on this afternoon. And last but not least, our discussant this afternoon would be Dr. Evan Laksmana. Dr. Evan Laksmana is a senior research fellow with the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at National University of Singapore. Dr. Laksmana's research focus is on military change, civil-military relations, and regional security in the Pacific, as well as Indonesia's defense and foreign policies. So to all our 5 panelists, welcome and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And I'd like to start, just before I start, may I say that each speakers have roughly around 12 to 15 minutes of presentation time. And I will start things off with Admiral Rey. Admiral Jean-Mathieu Rey, the screen is yours, and our IT department will help you with your presentation, sir. Please.
Thank you for the floor. Dear Ambassador Kembara, Ambassador Jenkins, Dr. Vermont, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I would like first to warmly thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the French Embassy for their invitation to this event. This seminar is indeed of primary importance to build confidence. I am sure this discussion will be a good application to ensure a better understanding of the issues and challenges regarding the Indo-Pacific region. This is especially important in the present context. I first would like to introduce, as French Joint Commander of Asia-Pacific, with the France Indo-Pacific strategy. Then I will try to explain to you why we should seek to maintain an area that is open and inclusive, free of all forms of coercion and founded on multilateralism and the respect of international law. The next slide, please. Thank you. I believe that we have entered a new geopolitical phase shaped by the maritime context. Open aggressions between great powers are now prevented by nuclear deterrence, and this situation imposes a limited violence below the threshold, which nevertheless involve risks of escalation of violence. Thus, the sea is a particularly favorable place for the expression of strategic competition and the proliferation of surface vessels, submarines, and naval weapons is the clearest and most worrying illustration of this. The tensions at sea that France is witnessing in the Indo-Pacific area, the dangers on international order and on freedom of navigation are likely to pose real risks to the stability of the area and consequently of the entire world. As a French sailor and regional joint commander, I want to highlight that I am very mindful of the maritime security in the region. As mentioned by our ambassador, we have 1.6 million French people living in the Indo-Pacific, and the French economic exclusive zone represents more than 11 million square kilometers in the world, with more than 9 million square kilometers of this area in the Indo-Pacific. To assume our sovereignty responsibilities in all our Indo-Pacific territories, we have prepositioned land, naval, air forces, and about 8,000 military personnel. We also deploy regular warships or aircraft from mainland in Asia, 7 navals since the beginning of the year, even a submarine, a carrier strike group, and fighters. The maritime security of the area, as well as the peace and the stability of the South China Sea, are obviously vital for the whole world. I firmly believe that the maritime security in Indo-Pacific is now everyone's business, whether it be illegal fishing, overfishing, sea robbery, maritime terrorism, drug trafficking, or even illegal migration. I observe its phenomenon every day in the EEZ, for which I am responsible in French Polynesia, EEZ of the size of the European Union. As you certainly know, France has established a strategy for the Indo-Pacific zone since 2018. The President of our Republic, President Macron, updated it very recently during the France-Oceania Summit last July. He announced a massive re-engagement of France in the Pacific area and an enhanced coordination between countries and Coast Guard in the South Pacific. I will organize a first seminar in November in order to define a roadmap in this domain. I intend to continue to develop military partnership with many nations because the challenges across this region affect the global maritime continuum. ASEAN countries play a major role in this. Now, since maritime security in this area is crucial for the security and the economy of the world, what can we do to strengthen it? First, I believe that we must talk to each other as we are doing today, share our visions without any taboo, and establish a common grammar. For France, the word grammar refers to a structure that allows us to understand each other, even if we do not use the same words and the same history. This common grammar or paradigm makes it possible to prevent escalations, to avoid misunderstanding. It is a powerful factor of security in order to prevent useless escalation of tensions. The code for unplanned encounters at sea, discussed during WPNS sessions, is a good example of tool to prevent incidents. France also supports the real good job done by the ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting Plus, ADMM Plus, working groups, and we fully hope a fast outcome of the code of conduct in the South China Sea. Therefore, we must acquire a common global picture. This is what France is trying to do. For example, by taking over the share of the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, IONS, a forum that brings together almost all the nations bordering the Indian Ocean. France is also a member of the Western Pacific Naval Symposium I just mentioned, and we look forward to participating in the next session at the end of October. The ADMM Plus is also an effective platform where France is ready to bring its own experience. France, therefore, wants to promote an approach which is as multilateral as possible. And it is in this spirit that we are developing cooperation and partnership with a lot of nations of the region. France welcomes European countries' efforts to increase their naval presence in the area in the context of the release of the European Union strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific on September the 16th. On January the 1st of 2022, France will hold the presidency of the European Union, as mentioned by our ambassador. It will be a great moment for us to support these two strategies based on the same vision. Partnerships are indeed an excellent means of stabilization and a security assurance. During its regular naval deployments across the regions, the French Navy tried to promote bilateral and multilateral cooperation. Our naval deployments are predictable and all executed in accordance with UN Convention. They don't aim at rising tension in the region, but to defend the rules-based order and to promote freedom of navigation and overflights. These partnerships create cohesion between our navies, and the exercises conducted as demonstration make our naval forces more credible and participate in the establishment of the common grammar that I mentioned previously. At my level, I intend to maintain a regular contact with my counterparts in Asia Pacific, like-minded partners as competitors. Similarly, partnership makes the equation more complex for potential disruptors who would like to hinder freedom of navigation at sea, to create situation of fait accompli, or to pose threats to the balance of the region and to the natural resources of the maritime space. This multilateral approach and these strategic partnerships should not make us forget that many challenges concern all of us. Unity is fostered by common goals and challenges. Climate change and the threats it poses to humanity concerns every single country in the world. On this topic, France is promoting numerous efforts on HRDR capabilities and capacities and training with international exercises in its territory in New Caledonia and in French Polynesia. France also fully supports the establishment of the code of conduct between ASEAN countries and China in order to limit tension about fishery and energy resources in South China Sea. All these issues raise common challenges which can promote our union beyond the differences in our cultures, our political system, our own values, and our economic differences. Facing the consequences of a cyclone or other disaster require a perfect coordination to be efficient. That is why France signed with Australia and New Zealand the France Agreement, which allows coordinating our humanitarian assistance in the South Pacific for the Pacific Island countries. International exercises such as Marara in French Polynesia and Southern Cross in New Caledonia allows a lot of countries to train together to conduct such operation. The next Marara exercise will be conducted in Bora Bora in May 2022. Next slide, please. Thank you. Before conclude, I will also mention the European project named Critical Maritime Routes in Indian Ocean, CRIMARIO 2, which intend to promote maritime security through multi-domain cooperation, capacity building, workshops, information exchange, and training in Indian Ocean since a few years, and now in Southeast Asia seas. To conclude, I hope that we will continue to make progress collectively on the path of cooperation between nations, and that we will always seek peaceful solutions for managing disputes at sea and ensure maritime security for all by working together to develop a common grammar and a common picture. We must all be firm in our commitment to freedom of navigation at sea, but also exemplary in our respect for international law, the fight against climate change, and the preservation of our maritime environment. Thanks to all of you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Admiral Rey. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's very clear on what the focus also and perspective are of French Indo-Pacific in the area, being the only European nation with sovereign territory in the Pacific Ocean. And the focus that you mentioned, for example, your operational, your effort to combat on IUU fishing sheds a very good light on what France's focuses are in the region. So thank you very much, Admiral Rey. Moving on, I'd like to welcome and allow Mr. Gabriele Visentin to have the screen. You have 12 to 15 minutes to present your remarks, sir. Please.
Thank you very much, and hello, good afternoon, or good morning, according to the time zone, to all the participants. First of all, I would like to thank you, CSIS, for this invitation. As the previous speakers have said, it's extremely timely, useful, and it really allows us all to take stock and look at the future in a positive way. I am particularly honored to take the word today, also because I would like to recall that the first ever speech of the High Representative of the EU, Mr. Borrell, on Indo-Pacific and on the work that the EU was going to undertake was exactly given in a speech hosted by CSIS in Jakarta in last May. So it's an honor for me to follow up on the steps of the High Representative, and it's also a political message that we would like to pass on, that about the seriousness of the EU's engagement on the Indo-Pacific. And if you allow me a personal remark, only the fact that the EU has decided to appoint a special envoy for the Indo-Pacific is a clear evidence of the fact that the EU has decided to give a particular attention to Indo-Pacific and to, let's say, develop a strategy which is new and which is also aimed at real and concrete projects and concrete implementation of its strategy. So, Ambassador Chambard mentioned already the French strategy, as well as some member states in the Pacific strategies, which go together with the French one. And of course, the European Union has presented its Indo-Pacific strategy, dwelling upon what the member states have already set out. And the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy is in the form of a joint communication, which was presented by the Commission and the High Representative. And maybe it's not of immediate interest to you, but it's important to note that this strategy has been presented following a request by the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the EU. So it is the highest political level of the EU which has decided that the EU should give itself a strategy for the Indo-Pacific. So why? Because of course the Indo-Pacific is strategically important for Europe, the region's growing economic, demographic, political weight makes it, of course, a key player in shaping the international order and in addressing global challenges. So the current dynamics in the Indo-Pacific have given rise to intense geopolitical competition, adding to increasing tensions on trade and supply chains, as well as in technological, political, and security areas. Of course, human rights are also being challenged, and I would like to underline the real high importance we attach also to the defense of human rights. And before talking about the strategy as such, I would like here to underline that the EU will remain a consistent defender of human rights and democracy and continue to use all tools at its disposal, political and human rights dialogues and consultations, trade preferences, and the mainstreaming of human rights considerations in all EU policies and programs in its external actions. And also, the EU will continue to use its recently adopted restrictive measures sanctions regime against individuals, entities, and bodies responsible for really serious human rights violations and abuses worldwide. So this is an overarching umbrella, which then, let's say, under which we develop our EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific. So the future of the EU and the Indo-Pacific are inextricably linked, given the interdependence of the economies and the common global challenges. So the EU and the Indo-Pacific are highly interconnected with many shared interests and solid ties, from trade and investments to research and development, as well as sustainable development, climate change, biodiversity, protection, and security. The EU is already the top investor, the leading development cooperation provider, and one of the biggest trading partners in the region. Together, the Indo-Pacific and Europe hold over 70% of global trade in goods and services, as well as over 60% of foreign direct investment flows. And around 40% of EU's foreign trade passes through the South China Sea, which makes the stability of the region a real shared concern and a necessary area of cooperation. The EU, and this is a very, very important element, is also a resident Indo-Pacific actor, because the EU has territory in the Indo-Pacific and has more than 2 million inhabitants in the Indo-Pacific region, which are EU citizens residing on EU soil. And of course, this makes it even more relevant and important for us. So it's not just an external policy, it is also a matter of EU's sovereignty as such. And that was already, of course, remembered by Ambassador Chambard, because the biggest majority of these 2 million inhabitants are French. In addition, there has been a significant military buildup in the last years, with the Indo-Pacific's share of global military spending increasing from 20% of the world total in 2009 to over 28% in 2019. And the display of force and increasing tensions in regional hotspots like South China Sea and Taiwan Strait may have a direct impact on European security and prosperity. And there is also an increase in hybrid threats, including on cybersecurity. So all of these developments increasingly threaten the stability and security of the region, and of course beyond, and they directly impact on the EU's interest. So the EU's increased engagement in the region aims at maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific for all, while building strong and lasting partnerships. Our aim is to contribute to the security and sustainable economic and human development of the region. The basic message is that the EU will deepen its engagement with partners in the Indo-Pacific to respond to emerging dynamics that are affecting regional stability. We wish to promote multilateral cooperation, including with ASEAN, of course, working on global challenges from COVID-19 pandemic to climate, from ocean governance to digital. And the EU's approach is designed to foster a rules-based international order, a level playing field, as well as an open and fair environment for trade and investment, tackling climate change and supporting connectivity with the EU. Free and open maritime supply routes in full compliance with international law, in particular UNCLOS, remain crucial. So this is as a sake of introduction, generic introduction with the main principles. And so all of this has led the EU to decide to step up its strategic engagement with the region by adopting the EU strategy for cooperation, which was presented 10 days ago in the form of a joint communication. So this communication sets out concrete actions and concrete ideas to advance the implementation of the strategy. And this is structured in 7 priority areas. I will go very quickly on each of them, because since the document is public, I will not bore you on the nitty details. And of course, I'm ready to take questions. So I would like to tell you that these areas are sustainable and inclusive prosperity, green transition, ocean governance, digital governance and partnership, including research and innovation, connectivity, security and defense, and surely, last but not least, human security. Now, a few words on all of these 7 areas. For the first one, the sustainable and inclusive prosperity, our strategy will focus on creating conditions to build back better after the COVID-19 pandemic. So we'll work with our partners to strengthen and diversify trade relations and to promote responsible business conduct and in an inclusive, green, socioeconomic recovery. And to strengthen this post-pandemic recovery, we will work with Indo-Pacific partners to diversify trade relations, including to address dependencies in supply chains. And the EU will make sure that all instruments not only contribute to economic development, but also respect human and labor rights and promote environmental protection and improve governance. And of course, since I'm talking to an Indonesian-based institution, I would like to underline, as Ambassador Pickett did in his recent interview, that of course, when ASEAN is ready, we could think of having a free trade agreement on a region-to-region between EU and ASEAN, for example. So in addition to the bilateral free trades, but the Asian FTA, EU-Asian FTA is surely something on the horizon. Then on green transition, the EU action in the region will also, of course, fight, mitigate, and adapt to climate change and counter biodiversity loss, pollution, and other forms of environmental degradation. And we will aim to conclude green alliances with like-minded partners that have signed up to the global climate neutrality by 2050. And of course, we will continue high-level dialogues and other forms of engagement on the environment with a number of regional partners, such as ASEAN, Australia, China, India, Indonesia, all the like-minded and all the ones who want to be included in our strategy. On ocean governance, I can say that ocean governance is in full compliance with international law and in particular UN clause to ensure sustainable management of the ocean's resources and safeguard marine biodiversity. And the EU will support partners on this area, including on illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing through our strong network of partnerships. And as fisheries sector plays an important role in many countries in the region, the EU will promote living and working conditions of fishers in accordance with ILO standards. On digital governance and partnership, so the EU will seek to enhance international digital partnerships in the region, and collaboration will seek to enhance technical, policy, and research on areas such as infrastructure, digital transformation of business, and public services and skills development. In advanced cases, the EU will seek to formalize these partnerships through digital partnerships agreements, negotiated, of course, with like-minded partners. On connectivity, I can simply say that the EU promotes connectivity with the Indo-Pacific region in a sustainable, comprehensive, rules-based way. And this will happen through a Team Europe approach, so that the EU will work with its member states to help partners in the region to put in place a regulatory and policy environment that will attract private and public investment level the playing field, and ensure the fulfillment of sustainability criteria. On this, I would like to draw your attention on the fact that the Commission will issue a communication on global gateways or / connectivity in the course of the month of November. And this was already part of the important speech that President von der Leyen gave on the State of the Union a couple of weeks ago. So on connectivity, we will be able to say more in a specific ways in some weeks' time. So on security and defense, part 6, I would like to say the EU has expanded its security engagement with partners by deploying overseas missions and operations in the framework of CSDP. And of course, this is open to third countries' participation, be it a military or a civilian mission. And I would like to underline that the first ever civilian mission deployed under CSDP was in Aceh, and it was the Aceh monitoring mission and to monitor the peace agreement. So there is an historical link as well with the region. Then we will probably think about ways of cooperating in the military and in the naval field through maybe joint naval activities or information sharing mechanisms, but this has to be seen both with our member states and the regional partners. Last but not least, the human security and the health cooperation is key. And in this context, the EU adopted 2 major regional programs last year to assist partners with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and future programs will continue to promote vaccine access through COVAX, as well as provide protective equipment and other medical equipment. So this is a brief, or maybe too long according to your taste, presentation of our strategy. And before ending, because I see that I have already trespassed my time, I would simply like to highlight that our strategy is cooperative, is inclusive, is open to the ones who want to participate, according to the areas of cooperation, according to the common interests and common values. So it's not about dualism, it's an offer of a mutual engagement, and it's an open architecture for the ones who want to join. So on this, I end by looking forward to the discussion, taking questions, and underlining once again the importance that the EU has given to its renewed engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and really looking forward to the French presidency of the EU in 2022, where the Indo-Pacific will have a central role, and we are really looking forward to an enhanced activity on that. So thank you very much for your attention, and I pass on the floor to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gabriele Visentin, for your presentation, sir. It's very important to note that the EU Indo-Pacific strategy does not only represent a one state, 5, 10, or 15, but it's actually representing 27 member states of the European Union. And that is a very, very interesting and very important achievement made by the grouping, trying to create a focus and also get the 27 members to agree on a certain consensus, at least, or a majority agreement on what the focus are that the EU should take into the Indo-Pacific. And I know to highlight the 7 pillars, correct me if I'm wrong, around 7 pillars that you mentioned.
Yep.
And it would be very interesting to see how this would turn out to be in the next in the near future. So thank you very much, Mr. Gabriele Visentin. Our next speaker would be Mr. Tim Decamp from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Yeah, you have 15 minutes, sir. Mr. Decamp, please.
Thank you very much indeed. And I may not take the full 15 minutes, so I will give some of my minutes to Mr. Visentin in return. Thank you very much to the CSIS for hosting us. And it's excellent to be speaking alongside Indonesian, French and EU partners in this event. It's a real privilege to speak to you all on this critical and timely discussion. I won't repeat the points that Ambassador Owen Jenkins made in his introduction on the wide strategic context of the UK's Indo-Pacific strategy. I'll quickly address some of the political partnership-based points and the security and defence elements of the tilt. And Caroline will say more in session 2 on the UK's economic approach. But I would just pick up on something Mr. Visentin just highlighted and echo it and point to one of the similarities between the UK's and the EU's strategies, in that this is the strategy as set out in the integrated review is there to show where the opportunities for cooperation lie. It's there to show a framework and to start a conversation as well as continue one. One smart commentator recently noted that Indo-Pacific strategies are often read purely as defense strategies. They're viewed through the lens of security and defense primarily. So what I would seek to do is to say it's really important for us in the UK to balance the 3 key elements of the economy, security and defence, and of the values piece that we have. And we see them as mutually reinforcing and integrated to the approach that we have, all of which seek to support the rules-based international system, because they can't be broken down into constituent parts and reassembled. So our approach is grounded in all 3. But that said, I will try and focus briefly on the security aspects, but also on the partnerships aspect, the underpinning approach that the UK is taking to its Indo-Pacific strategy. So the Indo-Pacific tilt, or the Indo-Pacific strategy, set out in the integrated review and the Defence Command paper, which was published a week or so afterwards, means a commitment to long-term integrated engagement with the Indo-Pacific. It means we will look to work with existing partners and new partners across the region to tackle the key challenges which several others on this call have already addressed. And we will seek closer relations through existing institutions such as ASEAN, and seek accession to the commitment mechanisms, the organisations in the region such as CPTPP. So partnerships are the key means for the UK to achieve meaningful impact. And of course, we recognise there are different sorts of partnerships that we're talking about, and many different configurations and organisations across the region to engage with and partner with. It means, as Owen noted in the opening, listening to what is being asked for, what people are looking for, and seeing where there is value that we can share and where we can cooperate for mutual benefit. So when talking about partnership, the UK recognises the centrality ASEAN plays in Southeast Asia and across and as the core of the wider Indo-Pacific and its regional institutions. So we are very clear, as Owen said, that we are seeking to cooperate and work closely with ASEAN to tackle regional and global challenges. And to pick up on one of the issues and looking for similarities in the approach, I was looking through the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific just before coming on to remind myself of some of the key issues picked out. And what struck me reading through the connectivity section is the echo of that collaboration and partnership, looking for partnership with organisations and institutions across the Indo-Pacific, picking out IORA, BIMSTEC and others as well. There's something which very, very definitely resonates with the approach that the UK is taking. Some of the UK's most important global partners are in this region, and we need to work ever more closely with them on the regional challenges and to address global issues together. The recent AUKUS announcement is part of this picture, and while it is important, as Owen noted in his introduction, it's not the only part of the picture. It does not challenge our view of ASEAN's centrality in Southeast Asia. Our efforts to secure and the pride in securing ASEAN DP status and the value we place on that shows our commitment to the region. But partnerships and arrangements come in many forms and shapes, and really importantly, they're not exclusive. So partnerships for us will also include working with our European friends and partners. And as we discuss with them, we hope in more detail, the plans for the emergent IP strategy that we see coming out of the EU, but then also national strategies, as colleagues have noted on the line, coming from France, Germany, the Netherlands, and potentially more as well. One of the key elements of commitment is turning up and showing up. And one of the things that I think we have seen in the UK over the past years has been a substantial increase in the number of political visits to the region, a huge number of ministerial visits across the region with ASEAN as an institution, but also with the core member states and other partners across the Indo-Pacific as well. This is not by accident, it is part of that demonstration of commitment and partnership to understand, to listen, to hear what people are looking for and to see where the UK can add that value. I said I'd touch on security and defence, and I will do so briefly as it's an important part of the picture. If you look, again, as we've noted throughout this conversation so far, if you look beyond the superficial differences, then many of the public strategies which have been released point in the same direction. I agree with a lot of the assessments that the Rear Admiral was making earlier about the maritime dimension to security and defence. It's an assessment that we would share in very large part. Our aim in security and defence within the Indo-Pacific strategy is to mitigate growing threats to our shared security and to offer expertise and partnership where it is being looked for or where it's being asked for, based on what we are hearing from partner countries across the region. So a couple of areas to specifically pick out. This means working with Indo-Pacific partners to build resilience capacity, to develop capability partnerships, whether they are being sought and whether they add value. And it also means tackling the shared security challenges and upholding our shared priorities of freedom of navigation and the rules-based international system. We agree with that assessment. The maritime domain is a serious domain, and it's one that we know that ASEAN members share, and indeed other member states across the EU, and as we heard from France in particular as well. So just a few specifics to pick out, and then I will draw this to a close. As I say, part of our approach is focused on capacity building and training, delivered through a longer and more consistent military deployment and better leveraging our existing regional facilities that the UK has. One of the key visible demonstrations of that is our current deployment of the Carrier Strike Group, which has many goals indeed, but is at its heart also looking to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific and secure freedom of navigation. A side note on that, I think it's a very, very good demonstration also of the partnership that sits at the heart of our approach as we work with US partners and Dutch partners as well in the Carrier Strike Group formation. But our defence commitment goes beyond the Carrier Strike Group. We will be increasing our maritime presence in the Indo-Pacific through the deployment of offshore patrol vessels from the end of this year, the Littoral Response Group from 2023, and Type 31 frigates later in the decade, all seeking to uphold the freedom of navigation. As we've noted, ASEAN plays a central role, and closer defence cooperation through the ADMM Plus is a really important part of that picture for us as well. And we will be seeking to make a bigger, more consistent contribution to the five-power defence arrangements, which are in existence already. We're looking to expand defence industrial relationships in the region, not just with AUKUS, but with other partnerships as well, and we will enhance our programme of exercises, exchanges and capability development with our key partners. We're also expanding our defence attaché and advisor network and building a new defence staff in Canberra to work alongside the existing defence staff in Singapore to coordinate defence activity across the region. So bringing this all together, for the UK, the political and security context is critical. As I noted at the start, it is part for us of an integrated whole. So the economy, our values and the security and defence cannot be divisibly reduced. However, we can pick out some key elements on the security front, but they are all underpinned by partnership, multiple partnerships looking at what is being sought for in the region. But for us, this is about commitment. Looking at what are the commitment mechanisms that the UK can demonstrate to show our commitment to the region, our interest and our ongoing long-term interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tim Decamp. Thank you for providing us with the succinct and also very sharp coverage of the UK's Indo-Pacific strategy, specifically on the issue that relates to the security and also to an extent defense. I understand, and I also took note, highlight that the three pillars of economy, security, and defense are all interconnected, and no one policy shall be made by just eliminating one pillar. And I understand how this could go in hand. And I'm sure that we would hear more on the economic side from your colleague, Ms. Caroline Reid, later on the second session. Thank you so much for what you presented so far, sir. Last but not least, our last speaker for the first session, I would like to present Ibu Carolina Tinangon from the Kementerian Luar Negeri. Thank you for joining us, Ibu. You have 12 to 15 minutes to present. Please.
Thank you, Mas Gilang, and Excellencies, distinguished participants. Good afternoon. First of all, allow me to thank the organizer, CSIS, and also French Embassy for inviting me to the important webinar. I apologize for joining late and missed the earlier sessions. I hope that my presentation is not gonna be take long. So it's gonna be brief. It's about the AIP. Indeed, it is always interesting to talk about the Indo-Pacific, as it has been pointed out in many occasions that Indo-Pacific becomes more strategically and economically important. And we have seen countries and regional organizations are developing strategies, vision, outlook to strengthen their reach in the region. And I believe the speakers before me already began to discuss on that as well. In ASEAN, we have the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. It was adopted 2 years ago in 2019 in Bangkok during the 34th ASEAN Summit. And the trigger to have this outlook because of the changing dynamics of region, and also as a guide for ASEAN engagement in maintaining peace, stability, and prosperity, not only in the Southeast Asia, but also the wider Indo-Pacific region. And the principles of IRP, I'm sure that all of you probably already take a look on the documents that are based on ASEAN centrality, openness, transparency, inclusivity, similar also with the one that just presented by the EU colleagues, that they also have the similar similar principles, openness, and also inclusivity, and also a rule-based framework, good governance, respect for equality, mutual respect, mutual trust, and also respect on international law, such as the UNCLOS 1982 and also the UN Charter. And the outlook have 4 priority areas of cooperations. Firstly, the maritime cooperations, and then the sustainable development goals, and then the connectivity, and also the economic cooperation, focusing on trade and investment. I think most of the strategies is also cover the same area as well. And what happened after the 2 years of the outlook, and we always have the questions how we can implement this outlook into the concrete implementations, or the concrete practical cooperations. I mean, is the outlook, if you take a look on the document of the outlook is open for the potential cooperations with other regional mechanisms in the Asia Pacific, and then also in the Indian Ocean region, and on issues of common interest to innovative, interdisciplinary, and complementary approaches. So last year, actually, the ASEAN has begun to engage its partner for the cooperation under the ASEAN Outlook in the Pacific. Last year, we managed to have the joint statement on the between ASEAN and Japan. It is on the cooperations on the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. And the statement is actually the first statement between ASEAN and its partner. And the statement comprises, among other, the commitment of both sides to support the principle of AIP and the possible areas of cooperations. And during the last PMC on post-ministerial conference on last August, Japan has announced 49 projects to implement this statement. Among other, those projects also include the effort to tackle current challenges in building healthy resilience in the region. So that's the statement that we already make with our partners. This year, we are going to we are expecting to have cooperations with partners as well, but we are still working on it. We'll still have discussions within the ASEAN member countries and the CPR and the partners. We are going to work with India and also Korea. So, but now is the joint statement still under the discussions, and hopefully we expect the document will be adopted during the upcoming summit +1 the end of October this year. More or less, the cooperation is cover 4 areas of cooperations under the OIP, and then of course these countries such as the Korea, they have the New Southern Policy Plus, and then India, they have the Indian Pacific Ocean Initiative. So for ASEAN, is the ASEAN centrality, it should be put on hold and carry on. And the other mechanism, it should be how could I say, it is not synergized, but it's as a complementary mechanism to the AOIP. So because the AOIP, it should be independence, it should be carry on the needs of the ASEAN, and we respect our partners if they want to have a cooperations with under the AOIP. We see as well, and I think the speaker before me also touched on the ADMM Plus. I think there is a progress on the work on the AIP and the framework within the ADMM Plus. They have agreed to discussion paper on the AIP from defense perspective. And the paper includes key elements, objectives, scope of implementation, and way forward. In the way forward section, it stated that the strategic discussion on security challenges in the Indo-Pacific region will continue to be addressed in the ADMM. And I think this is very important. I think this is a good progress that the ADMM Plus can, can have an agreement on discussion paper on the AOIP. And I think it's a good, very good progress on how we implement the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. And in the economic pillar, recently, actually, the East Asia Summit Economic Minister, through its joint media statement, emphasized that reiterating their support for ASEAN centrality and ASEAN Center architecture, reflected in, among others, from the forum, the ASEAN Outlook Indo-Pacific. So, which contribute to mitigate the impact of pandemic and expedite recovery. The AS Economic Minister already make a reference on AOIP, and although it is the scope is very still very limited to address the pandemic, but to address the pandemic and the recovery issues, but it's already been it's a progress within the AS, and through the ASEAN Plus One. The OIP has been, the attention to have the cooperations with the OIP has been growing, but of course, I'm sure that if you see the document, the AS is one of the framework, that one of the mechanism that has been pointed out through the AOIP document. And we are now actually Indonesia, we are working to have one of the concept paper actually to have the concrete implementations on the ASEAN Outlook in the Pacific by engaging all the ASEAN countries and also the participating member of East Asia Summit. But we still discuss on that within the ASEAN member state first. We are still not discuss outside the IMS because we are still exploring how to do it to make it the real concrete implementations that ASEAN needs, especially to answer these current challenges. And of course, through the mechanism PMC plus one is step by step, it's growing, and we are going to reach a couple of documents on that. But we are still hoping that we can work on the East Asia Summit. So I think the important thing is how we make it the concrete implementations of the AOIP through our partners. Some partners, such as the, I listened to the previous speakers, is open for the region, for the cooperations, and maybe we can work on that as well, and then to see how we can pursue this these cooperations, so we can have the wider cooperation and have the not just only a practical cooperation, but benefit to the maintaining peace and stability. Because through practical cooperation is gonna be support the strategic trust, the win-win solutions for the region. I think that's the important thing. Instead of the rivalry or instead of the competitions, but or instead of growing uncertainties, but we need to work more closer to have a practical cooperation, what we can do in the Indo-Pacific. I think is the key why the ASEAN outlook of on Indo-Pacific has been built 2 years ago in order to answer the situations that has been critical situation that has been growing in the region. I think that's all that I would like to say. Then maybe we can have another discussions on the detail. I'm sure that because all of you might be already take a look on the document itself, on the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, so I don't have to put in detail what is the outlook and but I prefer to brief you on the progress that we have in the ASEAN. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ibu Carolina Tinangon, and thank you for briefing us on what the current situation and condition are with the ASEAN outlook of the Indo-Pacific. It is very reassuring that we do have support and commitments from our dialogue partners here in ASEAN regarding the ASEAN outlook of Indo-Pacific, and we certainly do look forward in the concrete implementation of AOIP by all the ASEAN 10 and also members of the East Asia Summit. So terima kasih. Thank you very much, Ibu Carolina Tinangon. And last but not least, we move on to our discussant for the first session, Dr. Evan Laksmana. You may have the floor around 10 to 12 minutes, please.
Thank you, Gilang, and thank you, CSIS, for the invitation. And then let me say thank you again to all the speakers this afternoon. I think we've heard very clearly how each of the countries, as well as Indonesia, articulate their vision of the Indo-Pacific. So I'll just be very brief. I have two major comments, one for our European friends and one particularly with regards to the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. On the European presentation, I think we've seen the latest updates and the recent articulations of an Indo-Pacific strategy. But I think there are three major issues and challenges with both the individual European country strategy, whether it's the UK or French, as well as the wider regional strategy by EU. First of all, I think we shouldn't beat around the bush, and we know very well that the issue of an Indo-Pacific strategy is at heart about great power politics. So trying to skirt around the problem of US and China, I think, is not doing anybody any favor. I think we have to be clear that, as the previous speaker mentioned, it's not just about defense and security. I think the presence of specific European strategies or specific EU strategies is still part and parcel of a wider policy problem. Secondly, whether we like it or not, in a counterfactual world, the rise of different European strategies for the region comes from a strategic vacuum. And that vacuum comes from the increasingly unreliable role and commitment of the US, as well as the increasing assertiveness and some would say hostility and willingness to use coercion by China. And I think we cannot really avoid this larger a set of questions. And I think this also touches on the issue of AUKUS. We've heard AUKUS being mentioned a couple of times, but in actuality, AUKUS isn't really the most important thing that we have been focusing on, because the problem of AUKUS and the problem of the response to AUKUS is more about the question of great power politics. And this is not something that I think any of the particular documents have addressed. Now, strengthening areas of cooperation and engagement, all is fine, but some countries would like to suggest, or at least ask, which part of the document actually tones down and not increase the tension with regards to great power politics. So I think this is a key question. Secondly, with regards to ASEAN, we've all heard ASEAN centrality being bandied around, but the question is, to what extent is the mentioning of ASEAN centrality moves beyond rhetorical homage? Sounds good to put ASEAN centrality in every single strategy document, but I don't think even the different external partners of ASEAN and ASEAN agree between two different sets of ASEAN centrality. Are we looking at ASEAN centrality as a series of processes of engagement, Or are we looking at it as a series of outcomes in which ASEAN is hoping to solve or address, whether it's the South China Sea or Myanmar? This distinction between process and outcome goes to the different problems of interpreting ASEAN centrality. As far as we can see from a diplomatic standpoint, the focus on processes seems to underline the notion of ASEAN centrality, where as long as there's ADMM, as long as there's East Asia Summit, we'll call it ASEAN centrality and move on. But the problem with a process-oriented outlook on ASEAN centrality is the fact that we cannot blame other regional countries from developing their own non-ASEAN options, because it's clear that process-centered ASEAN centrality isn't going to solve a lot of the regional problems, including China. So I think when the European countries, as well as EU, speak about ASEAN centrality, we need to have a better understanding. Is the issue simply about supporting existing ASEAN mechanism, or are the European countries particularly interested in how ASEAN can solve regional problems? Those are two different things. Secondly, with regards to ASEAN, is the simple issue with trade-offs. The European strategy, as well as the EU strategy, I think has to take into account that you can't really have your cake and eat it too. In emphasizing values-based approach like human rights and good governance will naturally lead to some resistance by others. Emphasizing a closer economic integration will also naturally mean questions about who will be excluded from a regional economic integration framework. The application by China for the CPTPP, I think, will bring this geoeconomic question to a head. Is China serious, or is China simply trying to cut Taiwan from the process and the UK alongside? And these are difficult questions that I don't think we have a clear answer on, but I think it should be noted that there is no one-size-fits-all strategy, and there's certainly a lot of trade-offs from the different pillars that we've heard from the European side of things. And lastly, with regards to European strategic role itself in creating new strategic geometries in the Indo-Pacific, I think this is a lot more difficult than the other two, because whether we like it or not, there is still a regional baggage, there is still historical baggage, and there is a strategic baggage from the European side. A recent survey by the European Council on Foreign Relations actually shows that not everyone understands the importance and agrees what the Indo-Pacific strategy should be. It's only a few countries like France, the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands. The rest, not so much. So if there is no congruence and there is no unity among all of the different European states for an Indo-Pacific strategy, then there is no EU strategy. There is individual European country strategy, but that lack of unity, I think, will create problem down the line. And of course, we also cannot ignore the transatlantic challenges between the US and its European partners. From a historical baggage, it sounds good to mention existing presence and so forth, but one have to ask the next question: how did those existing presence come about? And this brings into question the history of colonialism. So re-emphasizing the presence of European interest as a resident power isn't exactly always the best strategy. And FPDA is not something that everyone fully embraces as well. So whether we like it or not, a European engagement strategy comes with historical baggage. It's not going to simply disappear, but it is in the minds of policymakers in the region, I think. And that's just the cost of doing business. And lastly, of course, whether or not the problems that some European countries have with China will be transported or sort of spilled over into its engagement with Southeast Asia. We have enough problem as it is dealing with US and China. We really don't have any energy left to also deal with the problem between EU or European countries and China. So I think the spillover effect is something that remains high on the agenda. Lastly, on the ASEAN outlook issue, I fully agree with Ibu Carolina that there is a way to find strategic complementarities and even perhaps a strategic convergence between the ASEAN outlook and the different existing Indo-Pacific strategies, whether it's from China, whether it's from the US, or even from the European countries. The issue, of course, is, first of all, a lot of ASEAN dialogue partners have embraced the ASEAN outlook, but the biggest ambivalence is actually from fellow ASEAN members themselves, particularly from those in mainland Southeast Asia. So I feel like we need to figure out a way to convince the fellow ASEAN members first before we focus on figuring out how to sell the ASEAN outlook to the dialogue partners. The maritime obsession of the document has created unease among some of the mainland Southeast Asian countries, for example. Secondly, we have to accept that the ASEAN outlook as it stands today is an aspirational document. It is a normative construct based on norms and principles and areas of cooperation we have already agreed on over the last 10 years. These are not new principles. These are not new areas of cooperation. So the next question then becomes, how do we implement the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific? Are we simply going to take existing programs and rename it as forming part of the ASEAN outlook? Or are we going to come up with new programs, which means we need to invest new resources and strategy to it? I don't think we have a clear answer to that yet, but it does suggest the willingness of ASEAN to at least play a role in agenda setting. And this is where I think there is convergence with what the Europeans have said about ASEAN centrality, that by collectively mentioning some of the key points in the ASEAN outlook, one can safely say from a process-oriented standpoint that there is agenda setting by ASEAN, because if the European countries want to talk about Indo-Pacific, they will refer or cite the ASEAN outlook. But that's not the same as actually collaborating and cooperating on new programs to solve regional problems. And I don't think we have a clear answer yet on, are we okay with just agenda setting, or do we want to focus on resources and strategy to follow through on that agenda setting? But I do agree that as a matter of principle, that there are certainly a lot more inclusive platforms that the ASEAN outlook can offer. The question is, can we specify that particular document with a more concrete plan of action, strategy, and resources by fellow ASEAN members first, before we can offer it to dialogue partners? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evan, for the crisp and also critical assessment and analysis on how these various Indo-Pacific strategies, and for ASEAN's outlook of Indo-Pacific could try and could find, a sweet spot or a balanced relationship between one another, and how it could affect the people of the region, Southeast Asia and also Indo-Pacific, and also to address the various security issues that are currently undergone at the moment. And of course, before I would let our speakers respond to what Dr. Laksmana has commented earlier, I would also like to read what the question box has provided for us. At the moment, we have a question here from Wafa Karisma. He asked several questions primarily to our participants from France and the UK. His questions are, first of all, what will be the preference for the UK and the EU strategy in engaging with Southeast Asia on the Indo-Pacific strategy? Will the UK, France, or the EU prefer to mostly engage with ASEAN, to build on well-established bilateral relationship, or perhaps to seek minilateral groupings with like-minded countries as what has been said with those who are interested? The second question from Wafa also stated, similarly, what specific things do the UK, France, and the EU will likely expect more from Indonesia? Do they expect Indonesia to play a role more as a leader of ASEAN, or as a country of its own, as a maritime nation, What do these countries see in Indonesia's role in the Indo-Pacific, and what do they want to see more of Indonesia? That's a question from Wafa Karisma. I would also allow any participants or any additional participants to pose their questions in the Q&A. Beforehand, I would also like to extend a question of my own to our panelists, if I may. Just a very short question that is reflecting on the various Indo-Pacific strategies that are intended to be inclusive, that are intended not to push aside or put one country in a corner. When we talked about issues such as security issues and defense, and we talked about activities such as engaging in military exercises and capacity building, and various mode of cooperation that are related to security issues, one can think that there are certain countries or maybe certain states who would see this development or movement as somewhat irrespective of their sovereign rights, so to speak, or perhaps they would consider certain violations. For example, certain military exercises in South China Sea would tick off the wrong country. In that sense, how would countries, the UK, France, EU, maybe countries within ASEAN, would certainly react, given their inclusive nature of their strategy, and try to assuage any countries that are involved within the region, that any activities that are part of the Indo-Pacific strategies or initiative does not intend to put a country in a corner, or does not intend to, put a country on its crosshairs of sort. So that's my question to all panelists. It's not directly specific to any panelist. Anyone can answer. And I also have one more question, if I may, to all of our speakers from Angel Damayanti. And she asked that, bearing this ASEAN outlook in the Pacific in our mind, is it possible to expand Indo-Pacific connectivity to the Persian Gulf and the Middle East, as the maritime in the region is also very strategic? I think this could be addressed to any participants. So with all that questions and also comments, I think we all have plenty for our panelists now. Also, Ambassador Shambach, also you'd like to have a question, please, sir?
No, I have no question. I was proposing to give my views on certain questions, not all, because it will take too long. But if you're right, just about Indonesia's role and our approach to Indonesia, we have to recognize that the outlook for Indo-Pacific was very much an Indonesian initiative, which was adopted by ASEAN as a whole, but certainly Indonesia has played an essential role in the development of this strategy. So it's I think quite normal that without putting aside the other members of ASEAN, Indonesia is a key partner on this approach. About the military exercises on the South China Sea, which can exacerbate tensions, I think the aim of doing military exercises or cruising in the South China Sea is, at least France is doing that, but not only France. Our intention it's to prove and to enforce the freedom of navigation in this part of the world. So it's not a question of provoking, just stating what should be the obvious, the rule of law and the freedom of navigation in a part of the world where more than 40% of the trade is going on. So it's quite normal. It can be taken as a provocation, but it's not because it's taken as a provocation that if you take the basis of law and the right of the sea, it is a provocation. We have to differentiate that. And I just stop there because I don't want to monopolize the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shambach. We'll start with Admiral Rey. You have the floor to answer any comments or questions that have been presented before you earlier. Please, Admiral Rey.
Thank you for the floor. About the cooperation, military cooperation in the sea located south of the China or in other seas or ocean from the big area of Indo-Pacific. First of all, as we can do due to the United Nations Convention of Law of the Sea, we deploy some assets, some ships, some aircraft to operate in this part of the world to understand what happened, and as mentioned by French ambassador, to reinforce the freedom of navigation. And doing that, we have contact with partners. Just an example, when we deploy our submarine early this year, French submarine Emerald deployed 7 months from France to France mainland and operating 3 months in Pacific and 2 other months in the Indian Ocean. So 5 months in the Indo-Pacific. During this deployment, this submarine operated with partners, with Indonesian Navy, for instance. So you can do that when you have built good relationship, confidence, and so it's the first step. Conducting operation or exercise together. And to answer the question of cooperation and the way we could do that by EU to ASEAN or nation to nation in a bilateral link, it's a question of opportunity, and it's a question of necessity. About my example on a submarine, France needed support, and some countries answered to the request or the demand of France. So it's a question of once again confidence, good relationship, and that's why we are working with main part of the ASEAN countries, specifically Indonesian forces.
Thank you very much, Admiral Rey. Mr. Gabriele Visentin, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. If you allow me, I will touch a little bit on everything because it encompasses the overall user activities in the field. Of course, I totally agree with what was said by the previous speaker and notably the ambassador. Just let me say that there is not a contradiction in terms between pursuing a policy of partnership with single states and pursuing a multilateral policy as well. So we in the EU have a long history of integration, which passes through national dimension and regional dimension. So it's an architecture which holds, and there's no contradiction in terms. So to pursue relation with ASEAN does not go to the detriment of bilateral relations with its members, and does not go against the enhancement of relations with single states. So this was a question that you gave me from the floor. So there's no contradiction in terms in deepening relations with single countries and going anyhow through multilateral frameworks as well. Of course, we should bear in mind also on defense that the EU is not a military power. It doesn't have troops or military equipment of its own. So the projections capacity of the EU goes through the member states, which enable the EU to do it and which second their personnel and material under the EU's flag. But the EU does not have military capacity or military equipment on its own. And this should be really borne in mind when we talk about the EU's dimension in military aspects. Of course, the EU and the High Representative proposes, let's say, military activities or defense-related activities, but always dwelling on member states' means, equipment, and say personnel. So that's an important matter. But this should not also be seen neither as a reduction of the role of the EU, because we are seen as a soft power, but allow me to remind that soft power can be very effective in terms of integration, in terms of promotion of interest, and in terms of finding mutual interest and win-win situations. And this is something which has proven the EU to be successful as a framework for cooperation, successful as a project, political project. So one should not forget the importance of soft power. And this is what is all about in terms of prosperity and peace and living together. Still, there are necessary means to ensure that this this international rules-based order is respected. And absolutely, Ambassador Chambard was totally right in saying that if someone takes it as a provocation, well, I'm sorry, it's a matter of perspective. Defending the international rules in terms of maritime security and secure navigation routes is a defense of the multilateral and of the international rules order. So I don't see it as it can be a provocation unless you don't want to respect the international rules. But that's another issue, which is, sorry for being not very diplomatic. And then, if you allow me just to maybe spend a word on Indonesia, since this was raised as well. Yes, I don't say that there's no need to remind that Indonesia is key, is by far the largest country in Southeast Asia, lead player since long time in ASEAN, member of G20, committed to multilateralism, so really a like-minded party to the EU. So apart from finalizing the free trade agreement, which is of course probably the most important open file, then we see possibility of cooperation integration on all the 7 chapters identified by the EU strategy. And probably on this, the ambassador Piquet might say something. He has already went public on this, but I would really like to stress once again the key important role of Indonesia for all its dimensions, including the geographical and the geopolitical, and absolutely the pursuit of multilateralism should never be seen as a detriment to the bilateral relations with the states. The 2 things go together and mutually reinforce in our views. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Mr. Gabriele Visentin. Over to you, Mr. Tim Decamp.
Thank you very much. One of the dangers, of course, of coming in after others have given responses is that they've nicked your best lines. I agree with an awful lot of what has been said, actually. I'll start by echoing Mr. Visentin and echoing Mr. Ambassador Chambard, that particularly on freedom of navigation and on perceptions of provocation, I think the UK would entirely agree with the way that Ambassador Chambard framed it, that there is a very large distinction between intent and interpretation. And I think the intent around upholding the rules-based international systems, the laws of the sea, is what's central. I won't run through every question, as I think a number of folk have addressed the points, but I think one of the things that is coming out from this, and one of the points that was raised by Dr. Laksmana was around choice. And I think I think one of the things that we need to be upfront about, and I think which as my reading of a number of strategies is that they are intended as frameworks. Frameworks aren't the same things as cake and eat it strategy, to borrow the phrase that was used. They're there to promote choice, and I think that is one of the things that that we need to be quite clear about. That doesn't mean that we can't have constructive and open and friendly dialogue, and by this I mean amongst potential partners to colleagues in the Indo-Pacific as well. That doesn't mean that it does it down for us the centrality of ASEAN, and I don't think that these are just warm words. I think that the actions and activity certainly that the UK has been putting into secure dialogue partner status, and then very importantly the negotiations around the plan of action to frame that and to embed that are an important mechanism for that. But that these frameworks are about choice, and that they help policymakers and they help us understand the choices that are being made. It isn't that everything is automatically without a trade-off. So I think being clear about that and being upfront about that is part of that dialogue and part of that trade-off. I won't rehearse the familiar arguments on the freedom of navigation of the Royal Sea. It's been said by others as well, but I think we agree with it. And similarly on Indonesia's place and centrality of Indonesia, again, as a G20 member, as absolutely, again, Mr. Visentin said, pretty much we share the assessment, the centrality of Indonesia and the importance that we attach to Indonesia within ASEAN as a bilateral partner as well, completely concur with.
Thank you very much, Mr. Decamp. Last but not least, Ibu Gabriele Tinangon, you have the final say.
Thank you, Pak Gilang, and thank you, Evan, for the critical views. I think it's also in our attention as well. And you mentioned about whether this is the set of series of engagement or the series of outcome. I think the outcome it's important, but how to achieve the outcome, it should be through the engagement. That's why that we are doing now. And the implementations of the outlook, it's supposed to be it should pursue the ownership of the ASEAN member countries. That's why in the framework that we are working on it now, I know there is still no documents on that, but we are working on it now actually for this time being. And the framework it's trying to engage every ASEAN countries to have their lead as a lead or shepherd on every project with the partners, and so this is we are trying to increase the ownership of the every ASEAN member state, and they have their own vision in order to increase the cooperations. It is not an easy one because we need to convince them. You said about we have to convince ASEAN fellows. Indeed, we need to do that as well, and we are on the process on that, because we don't want to see the outlook just only adopted and then we see nothing on that. It is not just only a paper, not just we don't want to see that this is just only a paper, but we want to see it is meaningful on the for the ASEAN itself and also for the region. And our goal is to maintaining the stability in the region and also the prosperous of the people around surrounding the area. And I think the Indo-Pacific is one of the key of the international trade, and also have a key role on the global supply chains. So the maintaining peace and security in the region is our responsibility. That's why we as Indonesia is trying to work on it, and then we are trying to propose the framework on it of the implementations of the AIP, and the challenges actually is because ASEAN has so many forums, right? And then we don't want to create a new any forum. So we need to work on the forums that it's already existing in the ASEAN. So That's why through the PMC plus one, there is the mechanism of such as the plan of action. So we are trying to work on each plan of action, and also through the EAS. I think next year the East Asia Summit is we are going to have a new plan of action. Actually, it's the plan of action is Manila Plan of Action to advance the Phnom Penh declarations, and we are trying to work on it. So all the areas of cooperations. The OIP can be one of the areas of cooperations on this plan of action. So we are not creating the new forum, but we are trying to strengthen the plan of actions to have a goal what is in the AOIP. So I think again and again it is not the easy one, but we need to convince every partners and also the ASEAN colleagues to have the same visions that is already in the outlook. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibu Karirina Tinangon. Looking at the time, I'm afraid that we're fast running out of time for the first session. So I would like to close the Q&A session for this first session. I thank you all to all of our panelists, speakers and discussant, and also to those who raised the question to our panelists in this session. And at the moment, just to avoid screen fatigue, I would like to allow our panelists and participants to take a 1-hour break before we reconvene for our second session later on. You may take this time to stretch your legs, have a meal or anything, but we will reconvene again at 1800 hours Jakarta time. You may turn off your screen, and then once we reconvene, you may turn them on again. So thank you very much for joining us to this first session. It's been a wonderful exercise, and we look forward to having you again for the second session. The participants are more than welcome to continue on and join us for the later session. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all. Admiral Rey. Admiral Rey, I understand that since it's midnight time in Tahiti, we understand that you may need to leave the room due to the time differences.
Thank you for that. It was my intention. Have a nice second session, and once again, thank you very much for your invitation. It was a pleasure and very interesting for me and my teams.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine, Admiral. Thank you very much for joining us late hour. Have a good evening. Have a good rest, and have a good Monday. Goodbye. Goodbye, Admiral.
Goodbye.
Bye. Hello. Good evening. Good evening from Jakarta. And welcome back to the CSIS Indo-Pacific webinar held in conjunction with the French Embassy in Jakarta and also the British Embassy in Jakarta. I'd like to welcome again all the participants who have joined us from the first session, and welcome to any new participants and attendants to today's event. We'll shortly begin our second session of the day, titled Infrastructure, Investment and Economic Developments of the Indo-Pacific Strategies. Beforehand, I might just have a very short housekeeping announcement. First of all, that the event is a public event, and it's being live streamed on CSIS YouTube page. So attendants can visit our YouTube page to participate within the event. And then the event is conducted under the working language of English. Without further ado, I think let's just begin with the second session straight away. I'll give the floor to the moderator of the second session, Mr. Dandi Rafitrandi, my colleague from CSIS. Dandi, you can take the floor from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gilang, for your introduction. Welcome back to CSIS Indo-Pacific webinar series, outlining the Indo-Pacific strategies, shared limitations amidst geopolitical dynamics, hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, together with the French Embassy and the British Embassy. I'm Dandi Rafitrandi, researcher from the Department of Economics at CSIS. We're in the second session. We will discuss about the economic perspective of the Indo-Pacific strategies, such as infrastructure, investment, and economic developments. I think from the previous session, we learned that political stability and security dimension is the important factor for the sustained economic growth and prosperity in the several last decades in the Indo-Pacific region. But the recent development of geopolitical tensions among big powers have forced countries to recalibrate their strategies in terms of economic cooperations. As we know, the Indo-Pacific is the world's growth engine, contributes to 2/3 of global growth, home to the half of world's people, and 90% of 2.4 billion new middle-class members will come from the region by 2030. However, in the light of pandemic, for example, in the year of 2020, was marked by quite unprecedented impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in ASEAN, which led to a 25% fall in foreign direct investment to the region. So I think this is a very timely discussion for this evening session. So I'm honored to moderate this session with a group of distinguished experts from various backgrounds, which will offer rich perspective and hopefully thoughtful discussion. I want to welcome our speakers for the session, Dr. Frederick Graf, Senior Policy Fellow, European Council on Foreign Relations, Ibu Marika Jakas, Head of Trade and Economic Section, European Union Delegation to Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam, Caroline Reed, Director, Economic Cooperation and Growth, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, Dr. Jayant Menon, Visiting Senior Fellow, Regional Economic Studies Program at ICS Yusuf Ishak Institute, and also one of my colleagues, Mr. Rocky Intan, researcher from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you very much for participating in the session in the middle of your busy schedule, of course. I would like to also greet and thank our participants who are joining with us in the session through Zoom platform and YouTube. The session will start with 12 to 15 minutes elaboration for each speakers and discussants. And then the Q&A session will start after the panel. So all the participants are encouraged to post your question in the Q&A features or via chat if you're joining from the YouTube. So let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Frederick Graf is a senior fellow, policy fellow with the Asia program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He previously worked at the Center for Analysis, Planning and Strategy of the French Ministry for Europe and External Affairs in Paris, where he focused on Indo-Pacific dynamics and Indian Ocean security issues. He also served as the South Asia Program Director at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. and at the French Ministry of Defense. Dr. Graf holds a PhD from the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva and habilitation from the Sciences Po in Paris. I think your recent publication on the European views of the Indo-Pacific is very resourceful, especially to know various perspectives on the Indo-Pacific strategies in the EU member states. I think based on the qualitative survey, I'm very interested to learn on the approach, debate, and also probably aspiration about the Indo-Pacific in each member state. So I want to invite Dr. Graf to take the screen. Dr. Graf, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Afitrandi, and thank you very much to the CSIS and the embassies of France and the UK for their invitation. First of all, let me say that I'm not an economist, and therefore, my perspective will definitely be tainted with much more political components. But if there is something I find truly timely or truly adjusted to the current situation, this is the subtitle of this seminar, Shared Limitation Amidst Geopolitical Dynamics. And whichever way you start the phrase, then this is still true, and this is really the core of the problem. So why do I say that this is going to be tainted with political consideration? Simply because we should start by asking ourselves why economic issues, infrastructure and all, have to be discussed at all in Indo-Pacific strategy. I mean, we will all repeat ad nauseam, I guess, this afternoon that the Indo-Pacific is key to the global growth and offers a lot of opportunities for French and European interests. And yes, this is the case. I mean, if I take France, in 2019, roughly 18% of French import and 14% of its export came from or went to the Indo-Pacific. And the fact is that there is a dynamic which isn't seen anywhere else, because France exchanges with the region have grown by 49% in 10 years, against an average of 27% with the rest of the world. And as for ASEAN, bilateral trade, has increased by more than 33% over the past 10 years. If we do consider FDI, the Indo-Pacific concentrate roughly 8% of all French FDI in the world. And the stock has been multiplied much faster, let's say faster than it has been elsewhere in the world. So yes, there is a dynamic here, and yes, we understand that this is important. But yet, economics alone do not explain why that should be included in the Indo-Pacific strategy. You don't need an Indo-Pacific strategy to develop a commercial policy, be it in the Indo-Pacific or elsewhere. You don't need an Indo-Pacific strategy to develop an investment policy or even a connectivity strategy elsewhere. And as a matter of fact, I mean, Europe, for example, developed an EU-Asia connectivity strategy about 3 years before it even started talking about an Indo-Pacific strategy. So, there is a connection, but essentially because all those economic questions are actually part of the strategic equation. And this is probably where I have a slight problem with what Mr. Laksmana was saying this morning, not because I disagree with everything he said, but simply because this is not simply the projection of European difficulties with China in the region. This is actually the same problem that we're facing, also sometimes differently in different parts of the world, Indo-Pacific included, but Europe as well. So for the French, at least, making infrastructure investment and trade part of their strategy is a way to contribute to this peaceful rebalancing of the relationship with China that the French President Emmanuel Macron did mention some time ago now in his Garden Island speech when he first presented the strategy. It was a response that takes into account the nature, the real nature of the challenge that we are collectively facing in the Indo-Pacific. And this problem has a lot to do with China, assertiveness and so on. And there I'm in full agreement with Mr. Laksmana, because we should definitely not hide behind the reality, which is that A, there is clearly a global power problem, and B, there is a China assertion of power, which makes all our lives slightly more complicated than it was a few years ago. But it doesn't mean that it has to be confrontational, because all in all, this is about over-dependency and therefore diversification. This is about norms and consequently political influence and so on. So when we speak about Indo-Pacific strategy, what we have in mind is the term reciprocity when it comes to economic issues. And by and large, the prevention of what could become the emergence of a new hegemon through a number of behavior going from the building of hardware infrastructure, which is by nowhere a problem in itself, but through which there is also an erosion of existing standards and norms and the replacement by new ones through sometimes economic coercion when, if, and where needed. And that's where the problem is, and that's why we insist so much on those things. But of course, this is not about confrontation. But when we face the problem, we face two different, although we all speak of inclusivity, we face two different notions of inclusivity. And since you were kind enough to mention the publication that the ECFR recently published about it, this is about, let me just quote it, this is between the notion of inclusivity, which definitely eliminate the China problem and deny it in a way, and one which, you know, still want to cooperate with China because there is a reality of the Chinese presence, there is a reality of the Chinese economic might, there is a willingness to cooperate also with China, but at the same time doesn't shy away from saying that yes, there are problems, and no, this is not going to be your way exclusively, and this is not going to be a one-way street, to quote the French president again. So, and that's when you have said that, you also get an idea of what the shared limitations are, simply because the problem is gigantic. It did exist before the China decided to invest massively in infrastructure. We knew in 2015 when China launched, I mean, it did launch it in 2013, but when it did launch the BRI, for example, we already knew that international financial institutions were roughly 2,000 billion short of what was needed to satisfy the world infrastructure. So, you know, we understand what the limitations are. They have been increased because this political problem has been added. And indeed, the perception of the BRI, for example, has changed over the year from something highly positive or potentially positive, because again, it was answering a problem which pre-existed China's arrival to the market, if I may say so, and was answering partly the problem, but then became something else. It became part and parcel of a political strategy which was detrimental to a number of us, be it in Southeast Asia, the Indo-Pacific at large, or even Europe for that matter. If we consider sustainable infrastructures, for example, the financial needs as assessed by the Asian Development Bank will be around $1,700 billion a year until 2030, which is something that one country alone, at least not France, can satisfy by itself. Hence an effort conducted at least two levels, the national one, and this, I mean, there is a reality of the French effort in the area, and of course the European level. France is part of the European Union, and the European Union is a powerhouse when it comes to economic matter, and as such has something to say. Moreover, we can say whatever we want. I mean, this is a fact that a lot of the trade that Europe is conducting goes through the South China Sea, goes through the region, and that Europe is indeed very concerned by what's going on in the region. Let me say a few words about what France does at the national level. You know, there is growing support for all sectors of activities in the Indo-Pacific within French means, but this is a fact that the French Agency for Development is increasingly active, with China representing only 13% of the agency's activities in the entire region. The AFD is present in 26 littoral states of the Indo-Pacific, focusing mainly on climate change, blue economy, and governance. Similarly, the Indo-Pacific represents something like 19 to 20% of all French loan insurance activity in the world, and has benefited from 1/5 of all loans consented by the French Treasury between 2010 and 2020. And more than 90%, of all loans have been attributed to infrastructure projects and digital connectivity. Interestingly, Southeast Asia is the first beneficiary from support grants to the infrastructure sector, 15% of the global envelope. And the French, again, the AFD has been operating in ASEAN for the past 25 years. So what will take place will be from now on, will be the amplification and diversification of what has already existed, taking into account new circumstances created, of course, by the pandemic and so on. But this is simply, well, is it simply the move for the amplification of what existed? Well, there is definitely an element of that, even though qualitatively this may still change over the next few years. But for example, the development partnership signed in September 2020 between France and ASEAN should be understood in that perspective. It is supposed to pave the way for greater cooperation with ASEAN, including in areas such as small and medium-sized enterprises, but also connectivity, including digital connectivity, as well as to support the master plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2025. I mean, I won't elaborate on the European level because this is going to be Mrs. Yaka's job, and I'm sure she'll do it infinitely better than I would. But let's say that France certainly did participate in the elaboration, pushed for the elaboration of the strategy, and awaits the implementation of the strategy released on 7th to 16. And I should add, perhaps with some impatience, as it has the potential to give the overall European presence in the region a whole new magnitude, which will be hopefully welcome. Just one thing before we stop on that. I should insist on the fact that this is not a strategy in the Indo-Pacific. This is a strategy with the Indo-Pacific, be it at the national level, and there are already existing mechanisms within the development partnership and mechanisms to be developed with within the context of the European strategy. This is going to be developed with the countries of the region. So this is a whole new approach as well. This is not, there is no objectivization of the region in any possible way, which is, you know, again, a de facto recognition of the shared limitation that the seminar is supposed to talk about. But I would say that we are just at the initial phase of the whole process, and this is unlikely to develop very quickly. This is perhaps the time now to develop the kind of dialogue mechanism that will help us to jointly identify whatever needs to be done. I mean, at the bilateral, it's usually easier, and this has been done. There are also models within the European context. If we think, for example, of the connectivity partnerships with both Japan and India, this is probably something which is to be developed with ASEAN. But there we are. This is the way in which we want to go. At least this is the way, in the direction in which we French would like to take the strategy, and this is also the point at which I will stop my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kura, for your presentation. A very some of very interesting points and comprehensive analysis. For example, you said that the Indo-Pacific strategy is all about reciprocity of economic approach, and then you also say that there is the financial gap for infrastructure is real. And you also mentioned that the sustainable infrastructure financing potential, it's still huge. And then the strategy for Indo-Pacific regions is not in the Pacific regions, in Indo-Pacific regions, but with the Indo-Pacific region. So cooperation with the countries will be substantial for the near future cooperation. Thank you very much, Dr. Kura. So the next speaker is Ibu Marika Jakas. Good evening, Bu. Ibu Marika Jakas is the first consular and head of the Trade and Economic Section of the European Union delegation to Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam. Marika Jakas joined the EU delegation to Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam on 1st September of 2020. Before, from the September 2016 to August 2020, she worked as the head of the Trade and Economic Section of the European Union delegation to India. She holds a Master of Science in Economics and Business Administration from University of Tampere from Finland. So I think I remember our research on the Indonesia and EU Comprehensive Partnership Agreement about the potential impact. And I think one of our key findings is that Indonesia, and I think it's the same case with ASEAN and Indo-Pacific, the European Union is actually a complement, and the cooperation is very much mutually benefit from the two regions. I would like to learn more about how it actually, the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific actually fits with the actual challenges, and also maybe you want to talk a little bit about the potential in the pandemic era. Thank you. To Marika Jagas, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Bajandi, and nice to see you again on the screen. I think last time it was indeed at the CSIS event on the impact on SEPA on the Indonesian economy. So nice to see you again, and good evening, everybody from Jakarta, fellow panelists and ladies and gentlemen. So I will indeed take a bit of more of the economic and trade lens on our new strategy on Indo-Pacific. And perhaps before zooming into the details, just a few general remarks on the economic aspects of the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So the EU and the Indo-Pacific are long-standing partners in terms of trade and investment. The EU is the top investor, the leading provider of development cooperation, and one of the biggest trading partners in the wider region of Indo-Pacific, with, of course, as a trading bloc of 27 EU member states. To illustrate these numbers, together our two regions account for over 70%, 70, of the global trade in goods and services, and 60% of foreign direct investment flows. So it's pretty huge. And in 2019, trade exchange between our two regions reached an annual figure of 1.5 trillion euros. And this is higher than between any other geographical regions in the world. The past several years have shown an increase of challenges in the region, both in terms of security and environment, and of course, the pandemic, which is of course global, not only limited to the region. And in light of these factors, and due to also the importance of the region, it's really essential for the EU to reinforce our cooperation with the Indo-Pacific partners, including in bilateral, multilateral, and regional contexts, such as ASEAN, and to promote the rules-based international order and access to open markets and ensure a stable trading environment. So then a few words of the operational concrete actions when it comes to infrastructure investments and economic development. So the EU has already bilateral partnership and cooperation agreements, we call them PCAs, with many partners in this region, promoting areas of joint interest such as trade and economic cooperation. And we will work with partners in the region to diversify trade relations, to implement existing trade agreements, to finalize ongoing trade negotiations, and I will come a bit more into detail into that a bit later, and to develop cooperation in other strategic sectors. As a champion of responsible business conduct, the EU will also ensure that development is inclusive, and it takes into account environmental, human rights, labor rights, as well as due diligence and best practices. In order to reduce technical barriers to trade, the EU will work with like-minded Indo-Pacific countries on standard setting and also other regulatory priorities in compliance, of course, with WTO principles. Regulatory cooperation will expand to support green and digital transitions, something which are also at the heart of the EU policy. And recognizing this fundamental role of transport sector in securing resilient supply chains and promoting a green socio-economic recovery, which is a key objective of the EU, will be to ensure the resilience of the Indo-Pacific region's transport systems against any future crisis. Then coming to our trade relationship. So the EU is committed to further engagement on open, sustainable and rules-based trade with partners in the Indo-Pacific region. Particular attention will be paid to implementing and enforcing the comprehensive trade agreements that we have concluded with Japan, with South Korea, with Vietnam and Singapore, and as well as the investment protection agreements with Singapore and Vietnam that are expected to enter into force in the coming years. So 4 concluded in the area for the moment. And we will, of course, aim at concluding the ongoing negotiations that we currently have with Australia, with New Zealand, and with Indonesia as soon as possible. When it comes to Indonesia, I know there are many Indonesian colleagues and friends here in the audience. We will have the 11th negotiation round of the CEPA negotiations, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, in the beginning of November. We had a bit of a pause because of the COVID pandemic. We were supposed to have a round in July, but it was just when the Delta variant hit hard here. So we had to postpone it, but we are back on track, and it's steady progress. It could be faster, but let's hope now that with the November round, we get it back on track and make some real progress. We are also resuming trade negotiations and starting investment negotiations with India, the country where I, as Pardandi said, served before coming to Indonesia. And with India, we had our FTA negotiations on hold for quite many years, but now we are resuming them again and adding an investment negotiation to that. And then we are also coming to the ASEAN region more. We are going to assess the possible resumption of trade negotiations with Malaysia, with Thailand, and with the Philippines. And of course, then the eventual negotiation of a region to region, so an EU-ASEAN free trade agreement. The strategy so far has been that we use these bilateral trade agreements with ASEAN member states as building blocks towards a region to region agreement. And but in parallel, we are also having a dialogue on the region to region, let's say the perspectives of that. We had in mid of September, we had the 17th ASEAN Economic Ministers EU Trade Commissioner consultations, where the ministers and our trade commissioner basically reinforced our commitment to a future region-to-region FTA. We are not there yet, but we have ongoing dialogues to bring, let's say, our positions closer to each other. And then, as I said, also using these bilateral ones as building blocks towards a region-to-region agreement. Perhaps a few words about RCEP as well, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that was concluded. We, of course, I mean, it is to us a conclusion of this RCEP is a signal really of ASEAN's, of the region's dynamism. And we view it as very positive. Of course, any agreement that supports rules-based trade is positive, but I think it will be a good boost into the region once it enters implementation, hopefully, all signs pointing to the beginning of next year. And maybe a few words about connectivity as well. So to promote connectivity between our two regions, we will aim to mobilize private investment involving the member states' public banks and export credit agencies in partnership with the EU's private sector and the EU institutions. And where appropriate, and in addition to the Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, which is a financing envelope, Global Europe, complementarity will be sought with other EU instruments also, such as Connecting Europe Facility, Horizon Europe, Invest EU, along with resources and technical assistance from the European Investment Bank, the EIB, or the EU Bank, as it's also called, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the international financial institutions. So the European Investment Bank will really add a significant, let's say, boost lending to ASEAN in particular. It could provide up to 3 billion euros of financing in the next 7 years to the region in Southeast Asia. And last but not least, we will also enhance our investments in people. So EU investments in education will be increased to at least 10% of this Global Europe financing envelope. with a view to strengthening education systems. The recent Team Europe pledge of 1.7 billion euro to the Global Partnership on Education will translate into increased funding for primary and secondary education, as well as technical and vocational education and training. So I think I will stop there, and of course, happy to take any questions later on. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marika. I think you already mentioned about and very clear that there is a substantial commercial presence in the region from the EU companies. And then you are also elaborate that some of the bilateral trade agreements are actually the building blocks of the regional agreements, which is very important for the Indo-Pacific region and also the EU. And I will very happy to hear your positive view about the RCEP. Let's have the high hope about the RCEP, and then also several focus that you also mentioned about the green and digital transition, and also how the EU have this private sector mobilization of especially for the connectivity sectors. Thank you very much. So our next speaker, Ms. Caroline Reed, is Director for Economic Cooperation and Growth of the FCDO. Her team leads on policy and programming on economic development, as well as global economic cooperation, including the UK's relationship with the OECD. Previously, she was International Relations Director at the FID, leading its work on international institutions and groupings, including UN development agencies, International Financial Institution, the G20 and G7, and the Development Assistance Committee. I think we would like to hear more about the Indo-Pacific tilt, about the framework, maybe Ms. Caroline Reed. And then I think in the last several months, and I think the UKs have been very active in terms of economic, especially in trade agreements. We hear that the UK wants to negotiate for the CPTPP. Maybe you want to tell us about, is there any connection with Indo-Pacific strategies as well? And yeah, we were very happy to hear your thought about this. So over to you, Caroline. Over to you, Caroline.
Great, thank you very much. It's great to be here, and to the other speakers too. So I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, the economic aspect of the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt, and secondly, talk a little bit about infrastructure specifically. And so as my colleague Tim Decamp explained in session one, the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt is our strategic framework for the long term and the UK's long-term commitment to this region. Expanding economic cooperation and trade will be at the heart of this commitment. The aim will be to strengthen ties, to bolster trade, reinforce the norms and rules that underpin free trade, security, stability, and support for open societies. So how? Well, in session one, Tim mentioned that the tilt pillars on the security side, including defence, cybersecurity, security, tackling climate change, girls' education, etc., that all creates the fertile conditions for economic growth. But this will be complemented by the economic pillars, and that will obviously include infrastructure, and I'll come on to talk about that. But there'll be key economic pillars, and you mentioned trade, which I think is kind of the number one pillar. We want to strengthen trade ties with the region. So examples of this include acceding to the CPTPP, concluding and implementing new bilateral trade agreements. So live examples include Australia and New Zealand. Trade, we're working on an enhanced trade partnership with India as a stepping stone towards a comprehensive trade deal. And we're looking at how across the Indo-Pacific we can strengthen supply chain resilience of critical goods and raw materials. So trade is one pillar. Second pillar is around economic partnerships. And this is both multilaterally and bilaterally. You will know that we are delighted with the ASEAN dialogue partner status. And we have great ambitions in here. We're agreeing a package of activity with ASEAN partners as part of this dialogue partner forward program, and we see this as a key part of our multilateral economic partnerships. We're also looking at bilateral partnerships across the Pacific region. So examples include a joint economic and trade committee, which was established earlier this year with Indonesia. Our then Trade Secretary announced this in April this year. We're also looking bilaterally and multilaterally about how we can improve regulatory standards and all underpin commercial activities in the region. The third pillar around our economic activity on the Indo-Pacific Tilt I wanted to talk about was using our ODA more strategically, so our aid more strategically. We will continue to support partner countries in the region to combat extreme poverty, but where countries can finance their own development, we'll gradually move from offering grants, providing UK expertise and returnable capital to address those regional challenges that are in our mutual interest. And fourthly, the fourth pillar is around cooperation in science and technology. International partnerships on science and technology are essential as we look into the future, and so it will be key that we have these in place across the region. So as you can see, the UK Indo-Pacific Tilt is about engaging, investing in partnerships, whether that be ASEAN, CPTPP, and bilaterally. And as I said, we're delighted with the new ASEAN Dialogue Partner status. I think we're the first new dialogue partner in 25 years, and that's a landmark moment in our tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. Our tilt is about promoting free and open international economic and trade with free trade, respect for innovation and intellectual property, and increased collaboration between economies. But of course, it's about mutual economic benefit. By 2030, the region will represent more than 40% of global GDP. So the economic opportunities for us are certain. I'm confident that there will be opportunities for the region as well. So turning to infrastructure. So I think globally, we know there is a significant infrastructure gap. So despite infrastructure investments having relatively high returns, so 20% on average, the global infrastructure gap is still huge. It's estimated that infrastructure stock is expected to need to double by 2030 to support growth, and estimates of what this costs amount to up to 90 trillion. And the gap in the Indo-Pacific is just as large as other regions too. As we look ahead in the next 4 weeks, the climate talks will be happening in Glasgow in COP26. And so when we're looking at infrastructure, we have to look at this through a climate lens. We can't just carry on building in the same dirty ways we have in the past. The World Bank estimates that between 60 and 70% of global carbon emissions originate directly from infrastructure sectors. Therefore, there's a significant need for green infrastructure investment in the region over the decade, and the supply of green finance is not currently sufficient. So this is a global problem, but it's also a problem in the Indo-Pacific. And as part of our ideas to address this, the UK hosted the recent G7 summit in Carbis Bay in Cornwall. And there, G7 leaders agreed to get change in our approach to infrastructure financing, including by strengthening partnerships with developing countries and by mobilizing the private sector to get capital and expertise. And we're currently leading a task force to flesh out what the tangible and impactful proposals will be on this initiative. But more broadly, we know as the UK, it's necessary for us to provide better access to green finance, and we think we can play an important role to stimulate access to finance across the region, both through two ways. One is through finance directly, and the second is through expertise. So taking the second first, looking at expertise. The UK, we share expertise that helps countries have better infrastructure projects and attract private investors into low carbon investments. So to give some examples, the IMF estimates that inefficiency in infrastructure investment actually leads to a third of infrastructure spending being wasted in emerging markets. And we have been working with a program called COST, which improves infrastructure transparency. And through that program, we are increasing transparency and accountability of infrastructure financing. And for example, this program has been working in Thailand, which has helped save the government of Thailand an estimated $460 million. Another example, we've been working with 8 large cities across the ASEAN region to develop climate resilient urban planning and infrastructure, such as low carbon transport systems. For example, there's low carbon transport system in West Java. As I said, we also work on financing, and we have usual financing arms of government, our Development Finance Institute, CDC, and also UKEF, which is our Export Credit Guarantee Department, which underpins sustainable finance. But to pick two other examples, we are the leading donor of PIDGE, the Private Infrastructure Development Group, which helps mobilize private into green and sustainable infrastructure. PIDGE has got a really strong presence in the Indo-Pacific region and is developing a pipeline of projects and working with innovative financial instruments such as green bonds and local currency guarantees. PIDGE is headquartered in the City of London, but has a regional office through Singapore, and in total, PIDGE has committed nearly $1 billion region. One example of what PIDGE does, PIDGE funds a company called GuarantCo, and this has been working with the Asian Development Bank to co-finance Pacific, which provides high-speed, affordable broadband across Asia and Pacific Islands, including Indonesia. Another example of some work we do on financing, Mobilist, and this is our flagship program to mobilize large-scale investment flows through public listed companies. So more than 90% of most large-scale institutional portfolios, accounting for, these are huge sums, 44 trillion in global pension assets, are deployed through or public market products. But in 2018, only 1.6 trillion of the 44 trillion were invested in non-OECD markets. And so Mobilist is looking at ways to refocus some of that investment and make sure that that investment is supporting both the sustainable development goals, supporting climate finance, and not just focused on OECD markets. So the final thing I just wanted to touch on was the G20, and obviously Indonesia is hosting the G20 next year, which we very much look forward to. The last time I was in Indonesia was for a G20 working group on infrastructure and investment. So very relevant to this discussion. I think the theme of the G20 presidency of recover together, recover stronger, just demonstrates how we have to act globally and how we have to act in footstep with one another to work together to make sure that we are focused on the right economic issues globally. So just to sum up, as I've stated, expanding economic cooperation and trade is at the heart of the policy of the Indo-Pacific. We believe in partnerships, sharing expertise for mutual benefit and engaging for the long term. And we have some tools and experience in infrastructure planning and delivery and green finance that can make a real difference to economic development in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Caroline Reed, for your presentation. I think you already mentioned that there are several pillars that will be the UK's focus on the region, which are trade, economic partnership, how you do aid more strategically, and then also cooperation in science and technology. You also elaborated some of the UK's efforts to increase the capacity of its partners through increasing the efficiency of infrastructure, which is very look forward to. And then the last thing that you also mentioned about the cooperation between Indonesia's presidency in the G20 and also the UK, and I also look forward to. Thank you very much for your presentation. So our next speaker, Dr. Menon from the ICS. I would like to introduce first. Dr. Menon's work covers trade and investment issues and economic development in the Asian region. His last post was at the ADB as the lead economist in the office of the chief economist. He was also at the ADB Institute in Tokyo from 2005 to 2008. He started work as an academic in Australia, spending almost a decade at the Center of Policy Studies at Monash University. At its original campus in Clayton, Melbourne, he has also worked at the University of Melbourne, Victoria University, and the American University of Washington, D.C. He holds adjunct appointments with the Australian National University, University of Nottingham, the UK, and IDS Malaysia. Maybe you want to give a perspective from the ASEAN point of view, which is we already said that it is actually a central actor in this in the Indo-Pacific region, and also because of your expertise regarding to trade and investment, I want to know about how's your view about how ASEAN countries can actually grasp this investment opportunity, especially regarding the sustainable and sustainable infrastructure, as we aim to increase the supply chain resilience, especially in the amidst in this pandemic. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Menon to take the screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Dandi, and it's a pleasure to be back at another CSIS event. And thank you for giving me a role. I guess you've heard from representative from France, the EU, the UK. I was wondering who I'm supposed to represent. I don't think I can claim to represent ASEAN, but I can try and distill an ASEAN view, if you like, based on my research and not any official sort of position with ASEAN.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. So I guess, I have a short amount of time, so I'll probably try and make just 2 points. The first is, as you alluded to already, how regional agreements can help us address some of the longer term effects as we try and come out of this pandemic. And here I want to focus on both the tangible and the intangible impacts, in particular the rise in anti-globalization sentiments in this region and elsewhere. And secondly, related to that, is how these sorts of agreements can help us produce a sustainable recovery. And I think we've heard a lot already about the role that investment from multilaterals, the EU, the BRI, various initiatives have to play. So let me talk a bit more about the policy dimension, which is to try and open up borders in this region and how these arrangements, these regional arrangements, can help in that respect. Okay, so those are the 2 things. But let me first start by trying to provide some context relating to these issues in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And here, because of time, I'll have to make some broad, sweeping generalizations. Please excuse me for that. I think the true picture may be much more nuanced. But with that disclaimer, I think it's fair to say that for ASEAN, foreign policy is more closely tied to economics, trade and investment in particular, than anything else. But for the US, more so than the EU, I think it has a lot more to do with security. And perhaps the Indo-Pacific strategy is an example of the kind of thing that I'm referring to. Of course, security and economics are related, and no doubt both matter to both parties, but both the US and ASEAN. But there is a disconnect there, and it needs to be recognized and maybe addressed over time. I think we have seen that the US has lost interest in mega regional trade deals, and this is because of domestic politics. The idea that these deals are associated with the export of jobs, of rising wage inequality, and all the things that we know as the unequal costs and benefits associated with globalization. So that's a new reality that we have to face. And I think with the US not interested in pursuing engagement through the trade vehicle or trade agreements vehicle, then it'll do so through other modalities. And this is where I think, some of the difficulties or the discord arises. But there's a void to be filled in leadership of trade deals or trade arrangements in this region and globally, right? And someone will try to fill it, and I won't say any more about that. But let me move on then with that sort of context setting to the first point. And this also relates to infrastructure in part, but more to investment and development. I think, in this region, the first point to note is that unlike Europe or North America, the pandemic is peaking very much so. It's nowhere near ending. We have the worst outbreaks because of Delta running through this region. And so even if it were to end anytime soon, the fallout, the long-term impacts, the economic scarring is going to be with us already. And here I'm talking about the rise in unemployment, in poverty, and all kinds of inequality. And it will take a decade or longer for us to try and reverse these impacts. Now, the lack of progress with the SDGs hasn't helped. This is the lack of progress leading up to the pandemic. But also, this lack of progress has made the impacts of the pandemic a lot worse. And the same impacts of the pandemic will slow progress with the SDGs even more into the future, right? So this is the problem, I think, that we face going forward. I just want to make sure that you can still hear me, because it looks like, oh, you can.
Yeah.
Okay. On my screen, I seem to have been frozen, and I'm not too sure why that is. But anyway, as long as you can hear and see me, that's the important thing, right? Please tell me if anything changes in that respect.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay. So right. So let me go on then. Yeah. So I think the greater investment in physical and social infrastructure will be needed. And this will have to happen when many countries are struggling with debt overhang from the massive stimulus packages that they've been implementing just to stay afloat during this pandemic. These are the very tangible impacts of the pandemic that will need to be addressed. We've heard already about the roles that the BRI versus other modalities in filling that investment gap, including from the EU, for instance. So I won't go into that in any further detail, but let me now turn the focus on to something we haven't spoken much about, and that's the intangibles coming out of this pandemic. And I think this is what will persist for a long time as well, going forward. And here, of course, I'm referring to the much more subtle but very real impact the pandemic is having on the rise in anti-globalization forces. But there's an interesting difference now with this whole story, because I think we're seeing a shift in focus from the trade liberalization to factor mobility. So protectionism now has reemerged in this region in new guises, and it has new names. So now we talk about things like reshoring and resilience even, as well, of course, as an old favorite, which is self-sufficiency. Reshoring is basically a call not just to stop investment outflows, but to reverse them, right? So FDI, of course, is the lifeblood of globalization. Reversing FDI is a great way to end it. And this is what I think we need to be wary of. These calls for reshoring and resilience need to be carefully looked at when they happen. A lot of factor mobility restrictions on labor have been raised as well during this pandemic, in the name of the pandemic. and we have to ensure that they come down soon. In a post-pandemic new normal, when things are, very difficult at home, when unemployment is high at home, we have to ensure that a lot of these labor mobility restrictions or border closures are quickly reversed, and they don't stay around for longer than they deserve to be. And this is where I think mega regionals like RCEP and CPTPP, and as well as the bilateral EU and UK agreements that we've heard about earlier, or the region-to-region EU-ASEAN FTA, can play a much more important role than the Indo-Pacific strategy per se. This is where I think ASEAN is looking to in terms of helping to lock in the hard-won gains in trade reform, and to try and to guard against backtracking when the temptation to do so rises as unemployment increases and all the other difficulties that we face from the fallout of the pandemic starts to rise. Finally, I think on border opening, I think ASEAN needs to look at what's going on in Europe and North America, and start doing the same very soon. Of course, they found it difficult because vaccination rates here have been slow in relative terms, but they are catching up, they're ramping up. So the planning to open has to start now. Of course, a lot of these trade agreements don't have much to do with labor mobility. Even CPTPP, the deepest of these agreements, doesn't have much to do with labor mobility. They have a labor chapter, but it has more to do with labor rights and trade union membership and so on, but not labor mobility. So here, I think these countries have to do it themselves, with RCEP and CPTPP providing, secondary support, if you like. But I think what Delta has shown us is that border closures are even less valuable in keeping the outbreaks under control because of the very high transmissibility of this variant. The only way to manage the Delta outbreaks is through domestic measures, not border closures. So the relative value of border closures falls sharply once Delta gets in. And Delta has got in every country in this region. In fact, even Australia and New Zealand, that almost completely sealed off their borders, were unable to keep it out. So I think the future must look at a rebalancing of border and domestic mobility restriction measures that moves away from the border closures towards more domestic focus. So with that, I think I'll stop. I'm sorry if I went a bit over time, and turn it back to you, Pak Dandi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Menon, for your presentation. So I think I got several very interesting view regarding the longer term effect of the pandemic, and I think it is very crucial to put this pandemic into context, right? If we're talking about the investment and also infrastructure, for example, the fact that the pandemic is not going anywhere, it's still ongoing, especially in ASEAN countries. This carrying impact potentially will be here regarding the unemployment and also the economic inequality. You also mentioned some of the other potential programs, such as the SDG goals and also the potential debt problem. And then also, I think one of the most interesting point that you mentioned is the anti-globalization as one of the intangible impact of the pandemic. I think I have to agree with you that this kind of re-emerging protectionism efforts from the countries might be have a very bad impact to economic integration and also growth in the future. A very insightful discussion indeed, Dr. Menon, thank you very much. So to give some comments and analysis, our discussant today, my own colleague, Mr. Rocky Intan. Mr. Rocky Intan is a researcher at the Department of International Relations, CSIS Indonesia. His research focuses on international political economy in Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific. He has participated in research projects on maritime security in East Asia, China's Belt and Road Initiative in Indonesia, management of dispute in South China Sea, development cooperation in South-South and triangular cooperation, and Indonesia's possible accession to the TPP, among others. He obtained his master's in international affairs from Columbia University on international economics and advanced policy analysis, and his Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from Pelita Harapan University on international trade. Over to you, Mr. Rocky Intan.
Thank you very much, Dandy. I'm honored to be in this panel. It's great to see especially Dr. Menon again through the screen. In my comments, I would not dwell too much on the AOIP and ASEAN and its flaws. Panelists here and in the first session have noted on its lack of details, a lack of novelty, and diverse enthusiasm among ASEAN members themselves on AOIP. But I want to try to take a step back and comment on the bigger picture. So allow me to put on my skeptical hat on Europe's role in this part of the world. So my first comment is on the economic reality of the Indo-Pacific. Before elaborating, I want to quote Dr. Amitabh Acharya on this. The term Asia was built by nationalists, the term East Asia by culturalists, the term Asia Pacific by economists, and the term Indo-Pacific by strategists. We cannot deny this fact statement looking at the trade and investment data and the existing economic integration agreements in the region. The Indo-Pacific as a region is still mostly an economic aspiration, not an economic reality. This is further amplified, for example, by India's rejection of RCEP. Looking at through trade weight, investment flows, the main economic links in this part of the world are still between and among countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia. The main economic game in town is still Asia Pacific. Then what's behind this insistence on the term Indo-Pacific economically? Echoing Dr. Laksmana's comments in the first session, this to me underlines the great power competition aspect of this insistence between the US and China. Then if that's the case, how does Europe economics propositions stand up to Chinese propositions? For example, going deeper into this, how much does the UK's accession to the CPTPP diversify its members' ties with China? And specifically on infrastructure connectivity, how can the EU's Global Gateway Initiative become an alternative to Beijing's Belt and Road, for example? And my second comment is on the geopolitics and the geoeconomics of Europe in Indo-Pacific. So as an international political economist, our assumption has always been how inseparable international politics and international economics are. The question then becomes on how these two influence one another. Dr. Menon, for example, has touched upon this for ASEAN and the pandemic as well. And yet, Europe's recent steps and track record in its own neighborhood, so to speak, can be a cause of concern for countries in Indo-Pacific. The first example here is the EU's comprehensive agreement on investments with China, particularly pushed by France and Germany with light commitments, with soft commitments on labor rights for China, which then got stuck in the ratification process in the European Parliament. To me personally, this shows that Europe's difficulty in balancing between standing up to Beijing on European values on environment and labor rights, and on the other hand, its appetite for the large, lucrative Chinese market. For example, Bu Marika Jakas brought up the upcoming EU-Indonesia-Japan negotiations. How does the EU balance these values of environmental sustainability practices on palm oil, for example, with its need to further engage with the economy through these negotiations? how can these green sustainable concerns not be captured domestically within the EU by protectionist impulses to promote its own alternative to palm oil and derail the whole negotiating process? The second example is, of course, Russia, talking about the neighborhood of EU. From its territorial actions towards Russian dissidents on UK soil, to its security threats to EU's own members in the east, and even its annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. These actions range from discreet to blatant disregard of international law and the rules-based order. And yet, the EU's collective response to Russian aggression in terms of sanctions has been underwhelming in forcing Moscow to alter its behavior. For example, the push for Nord Stream natural gas pipeline to Germany from Russia gives the impression that the EU favors this narrow economic interests over the national security threats that its own members face. So for the Indo-Pacific then, how does the EU stand up for the rules-based order here in Indo-Pacific, while it only reluctantly does so in its own backyard in Europe and its near neighborhood? Countries in the region applaud European countries' freedom of navigation operations here. But if push comes to the shove, will European countries stand up for the rules-based order in the South China Sea, especially given the EU's large economic ties with China? And with that, I conclude my comments. Thank you very much, Dandi. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Roque-Intan. So I would like to invite all panelists to respond to Mr. Roque-Intan's comments. In addition, a special question to Dr. Gerar regarding the pandemic effect on the appetite from the Europe to invest on Indo-Pacific infrastructure projects, and also how far does the EU plan to facilitate generally market-oriented venture like infrastructural investment to compete with other initiatives, for example, BRI? And how do you see from the EU side the balance between ensuring a market-oriented approach for sustainability in financing and projects, but also on the other side, some pressures for a rather state-facilitated push so that Europe can compete with China's BRI? That's actually a question from Wafa Charisma. So yeah, Ambassador Oliver Cambert.
Yes, thank you very much. I will be. I won't be long, but I'm a bit surprised by some of the assertion by Rocky about the position of Europe towards China. What do you want? Would you want Europe to stop all connections with China? I think the vision we have of China is not a naive vision, and it's not only a narrow vision only based on economic interest. I think you should reassess this vision. Maybe my colleagues from the European Union can be more specific. But China is at the same time for Europe a strong competitor, a potential threat, and also a partner, and in particular in climate, in the fight against climate change. So I think some of the comments were interesting, but not completely documented or not completely fair on Europe's actions. And I think that European presence in the Indo-Pacific is stabilizing one, engaging China, being tough when needed, and being present, and not offering the only alternative of just two blocks being completely rival. I think it's important to have different kinds of partnerships in this region, which is a region fundamental for the world economy. So, but I just wanted to not to engage a long conversation about that, but I cannot let that pass. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Cambert. So we can go to Dr. Frederick Graf for your response. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'm going to be short because the ambassador answered a lot of the point that I was going to make anyway. So let me say to start with that, yes, Mr. Amitavacharya is absolutely right. The Indo-Pacific is a strategic construct. It has always been a strategic construct and will be. It is the geographical translation of a series of strategic concepts which overlap most of the time, but do not necessarily always correspond to one another. And there is nothing wrong with that. What I think is wrong anyway is about the fact that this should be Europe as an alternative to the EU. Yes, there are a number of problems between Europe and China, not to Europe as an alternative to the EU, but Europe as an alternative to China. Yes, there are a number of problems, but the idea has never been to be an alternative. The idea has always been to bring China back whenever possible into a line of behavior which is more acceptable internationally, and not turn the win-win slogan that they give us most of the time for they win twice and that's it. So that changes the perspective a little bit. Now that more or less answers the second aspect of the question, the second question that was asked to me about whether Europe should be an alternative. No, it's not to be an alternative, it's to be something else. It's just to bring sufficient other options so there is a choice for the partners that is between something which is sustainable, which is socially acceptable and so on, versus something in which they will be completely submitted to Beijing views. And I think that having said that, I underline both the possibilities for cooperation as well as the real conflict of interest that we may encounter occasionally with China. And I certainly don't want to diminish those conflicts of interest. They seem to be growing by the day in any case. Now, about the appetite for Europe to invest on Indo-Pacific infrastructure project, or what did I say about the, well, appetite may not be there because, first of all, Europe, like everybody else, has been hit by the pandemics, and therefore resources are less available. But for the very same reason, there is the need has increased. And every political choice now is precisely sort of an arbitration between those two extremes. There is a need to compensate for what has been lost. There is also the need to accommodate this protectionist tendency that we see almost everywhere, although not with the same intensity in our countries like we've seen elsewhere. And that's where we stand right now. So there is not an easy answer. The need for both alternatives to China's options is present and has increased, and yet this is not an alternative. The need for greater investment has increased, and yes, the appetite may have decreased, but I mean, we have to face with the reality, and this is going to be for the government to decide between those two options. And let's bet they won't answer all the same way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grar, for your response. So we have one more question, actually, from Lestari J. Barani. The pursuit of greater economic cooperation between our European colleagues and Indo-Pacific states covers more than just tangible economic cooperation, but also covers the intangible economic cooperation. Yet we see the European states still limit movement from several Indo-Pacific states with the imposition of visas and with the current pandemic vaccine diplomacy. Will our European counterparts consider relaxing people movement and services between Indo-Pacific and Europe? Maybe I would like to invite Ms. Marika Jakas to respond.
Thank you. I was actually rather going to respond to the arguments of that was heard here before, but maybe just a few, because I can't can't limit myself. This time a trade person here. What Mr. Rocky was it was very interesting what you were arguing there, and I mean, one thing what you were saying about the absence of EU in the region, I think there I really disagree. I mean, we have now 4 FTAs, comprehensive free trade agreements with Japan, with South Korea, Vietnam, and Singapore, negotiating and soon hopefully concluding with New Zealand, Australia, and Indonesia, starting with India, assessing also the resumption with Malaysia, Thailand, and Philippines, and then we still have the perspective also of region to region with ASEAN. So I think we are very present in the region. And when it comes to EU trade agreements, we have a very robust, what we call trade and sustainable development chapter. So we do binding agreements with our trading partners on environmental labor standards. And now there is even more focus on the respect of the Paris Agreement as well. So, and this is something also that we are including with Indonesia, including there will be on palm oil as well in the trade and sustainable development chapter. We will have to somehow show that the CEPA will contribute also to a more sustainable palm oil sector. So just to comment on that, on vaccine diplomacy, I'm not really the expert. I'm a trade and economic expert, so I think I will not comment on that one. But you probably all know that we have been a huge donor of vaccines in the region, and we are really looking on how to boost cooperation further, and also try to involve also cooperation between private companies to boost vaccine production here in the region. So that's something we are looking into very much as well. So I think I'll leave it there. And yeah, thank you very much for very good questions and interesting comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jakas. I would like to invite Ms. Caroline Rey to respond to Mr. Rocky Intan's comments and also other questions. Over to you.
Great. Thank you. So I'll sort of start with responding to, is Indo-Pacific the kind of strategic label? And I think, yes, it is strategic, but it's also economic. When you look at, and that's why we're here to talk about this, when you look at the countries we're talking about, they are the countries of the future. That's where the growth is. So it isn't just strategic, it is economic. You asked specifically about the UK accession to CPTPP and what's driving that. And I guess it's the same answer, that it's economic, it's the dynamism of the countries within that agreement. We expect that UK's exports to the CPTPP countries will increase by 65% by 2030. So it is absolutely important to us to be part of that grouping, because that is where the future lies. And then the last thing I wanted to comment on, you were talking about sort of countering BRI. I think for us, a really important aspect of what we're trying to do with our G7 initiative is to make sure that the future infrastructure areas have access to quality infrastructure and have access to green infrastructure. And without that, we're not going to meet our global climate goals. And we need to make sure that the infrastructure is fit to meet the SDGs by 2030 and beyond. And so we need to make sure there is an infrastructure offer out there that provides the quality infrastructure and the green infrastructure. And I think that is going to be even more important as we come to COP26 in a few weeks' time and implementing the outcomes from that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Caroline Rey. So, Dr. Menon, please, the screen is yours.
Right, thank you. So I think enough people have already commented on Rocky's comments. So let me say a bit more about the question from Lestari Barani about opening up generally. The question focuses on, allowing more people from Indo-Pacific to travel to the EU. Well, I'm not in a position to comment on that, but I will say I think there's been a lot of anomalies here in terms of which countries allow people in and don't allow people in. I mean, the biggest anomaly, of course, is within country movement versus cross-border movements. I mean, we have this bizarre situation where countries with raging community outbreaks are subsidizing domestic tourism and keeping borders closed to international tourism for health reasons, which is just completely bizarre because there's more to spread around within borders than there is to import, especially since cross-border movement, when they are allowed, come with a lot of protocols of testing and sometimes quarantine. But even without quarantine, there's enough protocols in place to really reduce the risk compared to domestic movement, especially now with this Delta outbreak, right? To give you an example, I mean, before Delta, I'm in Singapore, on a daily basis, we used to read about 10 to 20 imported cases coming in. And local transmission was about 1 or 2. So now imported cases are still 10 to 20 and local cases are about 2,000, right? So Delta is only going to be addressed by either living with it, or if you want to control it to save your healthcare system while it's still under pressure, increasing domestic mobility restrictions, not border restrictions. So, and here I think, again, unfortunately, the trade agreements, the deepest of trade agreements involving this region will not really help because labor movement is not part of it. But what I think it can do is it can increase trade, and trade can substitute for the lack of factor movements, only because of, say, factor price equalization, right? We know that if you have trade, even without capital or labor moving across borders, wages and rentals on capital can equalize. So you get the similar sort of outcomes from factor mobility through trade. So if you can't free up capital and labor movement, at least keep trade moving, because it will offset some of the negative impacts of restrictions on capital and labor. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Menon, for your response. I think we are at the end of our session, and I want to thank all of the panelists for a very fruitful discussion. Dr. Grar, Ms. Marika Jakas, Ms. Caroline Reed, Dr. Giant Menon, and Mr. Rocky Intan. Also, I would like to say thanks to all participants that joined us in this session. So back to you, Gilang.
Thank you very much, Dendi. And again, thank you very much to all the panelists for the second session. It's been a very insightful session as well. We get to hear all the economic dimensions of the Indo-Pacific strategies and definitely what we could look forward to in the future. Unfortunately, as Dendi mentioned, we are running out of time. I'm sorry that we cannot take more questions as needed unless we want to go more than the allocated time. And we're going into the closing remarks at the moment. And may I first invite Ambassador Olivier Chambard to present his closing remarks of this event. Ambassador Chambard, please, you have the screen.
Well, thank you very much. Do not be afraid, I'll be very brief. We had a very fruitful, interesting, long afternoon, and it was, I was really interested by all that was said. And first of all, I would like to thank CSIS for organizing this seminar, which, given the latest developments in the Indo-Pacific region, was very timely, as well as all the speakers and moderators for a fruitful debate. This afternoon's discussion has, I believe, shown that France's strategy in the Indo-Pacific aims to promote a free, open, inclusive, but also stable and peaceful Indo-Pacific. approach entails seeking synergies with the region's major players and consolidating our partnerships with like-minded countries and regional organizations in order to help the region meet the challenges it faces, whether it be securing its maritime spaces and preserving a zone of stability where international laws, including UNCLOS, are recognized and enforced, and contributing to the construction of sustainable infrastructures, combating the effects of climate change, preserving biodiversity, or responding to the challenge of global health while respecting the sovereignty of states. In that regard, given the central role of ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific region, intensifying our relations with the association and its member countries is a priority of our strategy. And we will build on our recently concluded development partnership. With regard to the evolution of the strategic context, France believes that the region needs cooperation and inclusiveness, not confrontation. More than ever, France and its European partners must remain actors in a region that constitutes the new economic and strategic center of gravity of the planet. We are committed to meeting all the challenges of the Indo-Pacific, and we are fully mobilized with our European partners to this end. Thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak.
Sama-sama, terima kasih. Thank you very much, Ambassador Chambak, for your closing remark. Next, may I present Ambassador Owen Jenkins, please, to present his opening remarks. Ambassador Jenkins, you have the screen.
Thank you very much indeed. And let me to first express my thanks both to CSIS and to the Embassy of France for working with us to organise today's webinar. I think it's been a tremendously rich and fruitful discussion with a whole range of issues coming up consistently in a number of speeches. And I'd just pick out three things, I think, which really struck me in a number of the interventions. The first was the interdependency, the inextricable nature of the various things that we've talked about. So the way that security, prosperity, and the rules-based international system go together. I think we've all talked, whichever strategy we've been describing, whether that's British Indo-Pacific tilt, the European Union's strategy for the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN's outlook, or the French strategy for the Indo-Pacific, we've all talked about the rules-based international system, respect for international law as the underpinnings, the essential underpinnings for shared security and sustainable development across the region. And I think that set of connections is particularly important. The second thing that I would highlight is climate change, which perhaps I talked too little about in my opening remarks. And I think what's come through the various interventions today is whether one is talking about a security dimension or about an economic dimension, climate change is in many ways the greatest single threat that we face as a global community and as regional actors. We've heard from a number of speakers, the risks that we take if we don't invest in the right sort of infrastructure, if we don't invest in sustainable infrastructure, which will be resilient to the sorts of threats which we will face in the future and which will dramatically reduce the emissions so that we keep on track for the Paris Agreement's climate goals. And I think that that also came up in the security section, which is increasingly the case, I think, the idea that climate change can be a factor in regional security relationships. And the third point that I would make, and this in some ways is the most important, is the consistent emphasis which we've heard on collaborative solutions. We heard in the first session a question about whether bilateral relationships or multilateral relationships were the way forward. And that really made me think, I think it said in answer to that we need all of those things. There will be an important role for strong bilateral relationships, but there will also be a role for multilateral engagements, both at a global level through our shared United Nations, but also through more bespoke arrangements, whether those are things like the CPTPP, AUKUS or others. And I'd also highlight in that context the absolute centrality of ASEAN. It's a truism now that we talk about ASEAN centrality, but it is the organization that we keep all of us kept coming back to, that this is the body at the center of regional security and prosperity. And its principles, the principles embedded in its founding treaty, are the ones which motivate us today. So that sense of this being a like-minded community of countries wanting to work together to the same ends, despite occasional differences in approach, I think was immensely strong in today's webinar. And I take that as a positive and encouraging sign for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Owen Jenkins, for your closing remarks. Last, representing CSIS, may I present Dr. Shafia Fifi Muhibat, the Head of Department for Department of International Relations at CSIS. Dr. Muhibat, you have the screen.
Thank you so much, Gilang. I'd like to begin by, of course, extending our gratitude on behalf of CSIS to our co-organizers for this event, the French Embassy, Ambassador Olivier Chambard, and the British Embassy, Ambassador Owen Jenkins, for this wonderful collaboration that we have today. We designed the discussion today basically to have a thorough discussion on the various strategies on Indo-Pacific. And I think looking from the point of view of Southeast Asia, our main objective is of course identifying what or which from each of these strategies would offer to the betterment of Southeast Asia and its people, be it on issues of political security and also on economic issues. And we also question, would these strategies increase the welfare of the people living in the region? Could these strategies create interconnectivity or division? And many other questions. Indo-Pacific has been a long-standing issue of research at CSIS. We have our the CSIS lecture series on regional dynamics, for example. So please rest assured that the issue of Indo-Pacific will be in our future agenda as well. And there will be follow-ups, further discussion on this particular issue, because I think we do have some unanswered questions, if not a lot, actually, still more to be discussed from this. Also, I would like to thank all of the participants who have joined us throughout the two sessions. It's already evening here in Jakarta, so thank you so much for joining us and also for participating in raising questions in the discussion. So again, thank you. And I look forward to future collaboration with many of our partners here in Jakarta. Thank you so much. Back to you, Gilang.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shafia Muhibat. And with that, I'd like to formally close today's event, CSIS Indo-Pacific webinar, collaborated in conjunction with the Embassy of France in Jakarta and the British Embassy as well. My heartfelt thanks goes out to both co-organizers, Ambassador Olivier Chambard and Ambassador Owen Jenkins, for assisting us in preparing for the event. I do understand, and I do expect we will have more cooperation to follow up in the near future. As my head of department said, this issue will be going on for the long run. So thank you very much for all the participants who have joined us from the afternoon to the evening, and we'll look forward to our next event in the near future. Thank you, and have a good evening and good afternoon to those who are in Europe.